Chapter 646. Sigurd did not give the order for the disciples of the Sword Hut to kill Fan Xian. He didn't even spare the leader of the Overwatch Council assassins who had dared to stab him. This reality made the disciples of the Sword Hut feel a glimmer of surprise and shock. Yunjilan, who had silently walked out of the Sword Hut, felt even heavier. He looked around. His third brother and fourth brother were both left in the Sword Hut. It seemed that his teacher had something to tell them. Yunjilan couldn't resist looking at the setting sun in the west and gently sighed. These two brothers respected him the most. They had also participated in keeping 13th Wang under house arrest and ambushing Fan Xian. Was the teacher keeping them here to ask about this matter? Given his understanding of Sigurd, if his teacher truly wanted to punish him for his actions, he probably wouldn't need to investigate or ask anything. He would directly have him kill himself. It would probably be difficult for him to summon the courage to resist. The faint light of dusk shone on the face of the first disciple of the Sword Hut. It was somewhat dim and helpless. Today, the entire manner of the master of the city had died. It had sufficiently demonstrated Sigurd's attitude. In a few more days, the dragon flag of the Li family would probably be replaced by the dragon flag of the Dongyi Palace. He knew that perhaps this was an inevitability of history. Otherwise, his teacher would not have reached an agreement with Fan Xian and lowered his head to the Qing emperor. However, his heart still couldn't help but throb with pain. There was no longer any way to stop this matter from happening. One of the major powers in Dongyi, the manor of the master of the city, had all become corpses in pools of blood. Sigurd had used the simplest and crudest method to unify the thoughts of the entire upper class of Dongyi society and intimidate the thoughts of all the disciples in the Sword Hut. Presumably, the countless merchants and workers in the city were also willing to accept this reality. After all, fighting had never been an entertainment that merchants liked. Yunjilan narrowed his eyes and looked at the mountain residence above. The Northern Qi Emperor had already silently returned to the mountain residence under the protection of Lang Tiao and Friar He. He didn't know what the Northern Qi people were thinking. Should he end the agreement he had secretly reached with them or continue moving forward? Following this, the mountain residence closed its doors and refused guests. This made Yunjilan's complicated emotions even more complicated. The Northern Qi Emperor had risked thousands of li to come here. He must have had the attitude of paying a great price to finish this battle in one fell swoop. Why did the Emperor seem to admit defeat after he was taken into the Sword Hut by Fan Xian and no longer try to tear apart the relationship between Dongyi and the Qing kingdom? Yunjilan stood outside the mountain residence and quietly said a few words to Lang Tiao. With some sadness, he walked down the mountain. As he walked, he thought to himself, just what kind of miraculous ability does Fan Xian have to be able to suppress Northern Qi until they can't move? He still didn't believe Fan Xian had this ability. He thought it must be because his teacher had clearly expressed his attitude to the Northern Qi Emperor that the Northern Qi people had become hopeless. Turning his head to glance at the Sword Hut in the dusk, Yunjilan's expression was very serious. After a slight pause, he walked toward Dongyi. He would never betray the will of the Sword Hut and the interests of Dongyi. However, the people of Dongyi were anxious. Without the pressure of the officials of the master of the city, he, the first disciple of the Sword Hut, could only helplessly begin to manage state affairs. Contrary to what Yunjilan had imagined, the Northern Qi people did not despair. More accurately, the Northern Qi Emperor, whose surname was Zhan, did not despair. She sat coldly by the window and looked at the flowers burning like fire. Thinking of what had happened these 2 days, she couldn't help but feel her heart waver. When she was young, she had been held in the Empress Dowager's arms and sat on the throne. From that day on, she had no longer known fear or despair. A person in a certain position should have a corresponding ability to judge. The little emperor knew that in the matter of fighting for Dongyi, she had already lost to Fan Xian. She had lost completely. There was no chance of turning the situation around. On the other hand, she also knew that Sigurd had chosen the Qing kingdom not because this great grandmaster had any good feelings toward the Qing kingdom. Rather, it was because Fan Xian's existence seemed to be able to provide Dongyi with a sliver of protection in the future. The most important problem was still hidden in Sigurd heart. After the clever Northern Qi emperor thought for a long time, she faintly grasped the crux. Although she still didn't know the details, she guessed that Sigurd would certainly cause Fan Xian a great deal of trouble in the future. Fan Xian's trouble was the Qing emperor's trouble and Northern Qi's blessing. Although she knew that if Fan Xian was truly ruthless enough, she could only become a puppet in his hands, Fan Xian had never been ruthless enough, particularly toward his own woman. The events of that night made the little emperor feel humiliated, stimulated, excited, and curious. Thinking about it in hindsight, it seemed to have been of great benefit. Fan Xian used this to control the little emperor. The little emperor also used the relationship between the two of them to put Fan Xian in a difficult position. The little emperor slowly turned her head and looked coldly at Sea Lily sitting by the bed. She said, "Beloved, comb my hair." Including Fan Ruoruo, there were 3.5 women on Northern Qi's side. As the little emperor calmly enjoyed Sea Lily's hand combing her hair, she silently thought about what Fan Xian should do with 3.5 women facing a father with potential cracks. Fan Xian was in the depths of the sword hut. Standing outside the door, he looked calmly at Sigurd on the bed. After the shadow woke up, he had found a place to heal. As a top assassin, he always had a final lair to lick his wounds. Fan Xian was not worried about this. In the dusk, he once again faced the sword-like gazes of the people of the sword hut and walked into the depths of the sword hut to deal with what the Northern Qi emperor had thought of earlier. Sigurd could bring him great trouble in the future. 13th Wang coughed and glanced at him. Carrying the basin of hot water, he walked past him and didn't say anything. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the bloodstains on his back. He couldn't resist smiling. The scene earlier when he had turned his back on his teacher confirmed Sigurd's love for this young disciple. Including the basin of hot water inside the sect and the towel wiping his body, even a great grandmaster was sometimes like a pitiful old man being served by a filial son. The more Sigurd favored 13th Wang, the calmer Fan Xian's heart became. He coughed and cleared the thoughts in his mind. Stepping over the threshold, he sat on the chair by the bed. Looking at Sigurd who had his eyes tightly closed, he said, "The shadow will not take over the sword hut." The rooms in the depths of the sword hut were completely silent. Other than 13th Wang in the courtyard, no one else could stay there. Even the sword children who served Sigurd personally had long been chased to the front of the hut. These abrupt words rang out in the quiet room, rising in spirals and not stopping for a long time. They came without reason and were spoken without rhyme or reason. The shadow was someone who wanted to kill Sigurd and was an official of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. Yet, Fan Xian had seriously said to Sigurd that the shadow would not take over the sword hut. Would Sigurd allow the shadow to inherit his most precious legacy in this world? Shockingly, Sigurd did not laugh at Fan Xian's speculation. Slowly opening his eyes, he carried a heart-shaking coldness. In a raspy voice, he said, "Why can't he?" Fan Xian's heart tightened slightly. He hadn't thought that with one sentence, this great grandmaster would directly reveal his true thoughts. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. In a quiet voice, he said, "Because he is my person." You are half a Dongyi person, but he is an entire Dongyi person. Sigurd slowly closed his eyes again. He is my younger brother. He is the true first disciple of the sword hut. After I die, if he doesn't take over the sword hut, does he have to hand it to you? Me? Fan Xian shrugged. I have my own teacher. Furthermore, I don't have the hobby of starting a sect. Sigurd closed his eyes and said, "How did you guess my thoughts?" Yunjilan was originally a good choice. Unfortunately, he went against your wishes this time. Furthermore, he is used to official work. In terms of swordsmanship, it is difficult for him to advance. You won't just watch as the sword hut declines after your death. 13th Wang is a good choice. Unfortunately, you dote on him too much and have too high hopes for him. You would not want him to be bound by these grass huts. Only the shadow. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. You didn't kill him not because you couldn't bear to kill him. Saints are heartless. This is something you admitted earlier. You left the shadow with his life. Naturally, you have to use this life. If you leave the position of master of the sword hut to him, it will cause trouble in the future. You and I both know this. So, the matter at the hanging temple was really done by Chen Pingping. Sigurd suddenly cackled with great joy. Looks like even I have misjudged this old dog. He has no loyalty to your emperor to speak of. Fan Xian was not angry. He smiled warmly and said, no one can doubt the director's loyalty to the Qin kingdom. If you want the shadow to rise to the surface and incite a battle between the emperor and the director, I advise you to quickly give up. Sigurd fell silent. He didn't speak for a long time. The entire sword hut was enveloped in an oppressive atmosphere. From last night until now, Sigurd finally understood that Fan Xian, the son of an old friend, indeed had a calmness and even coldness that was difficult to find for normal people. He had guessed the true intentions he had been hiding from his slight movements. How long can you hide the fact that the shadow is my younger brother? A year? 2 years? Sigurd suddenly said coldly. What happened in Dongyi today will eventually be sent back to Jingdo. Do you really think your emperor won't guess anything? I don't care what he guesses. As long as he can drag it out, that's that. I hope you don't make this matter clear and real. Fan Xian looked at Sigurd thin face without shrinking back. In Dongyi, there are only 6 people who can guess the shadow's identity. Earlier, the 3rd and 4th disciples in the hut had already seen you and told you what happened the night before. Presumably, you had them seal their mouths. Given your position in their hearts, they probably won't say anything for the rest of their lives. As for 13th Wang, I believe in his nature and virtue. All that is left is me, you, and the little emperor. If you don't say anything and I don't say anything, what is there to be afraid of? Sigurd coldly said, the problem is that you still have no way of convincing me. Why wouldn't I say anything? Once the world knows of this matter, your emperor will certainly kill Chen Pingping. If Chen Pingping dies, what will you do? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, you pretended to agree to the agreement between us. In reality, you put your sights on the future. If the director died, the Qin kingdom would sink into internal strife. How would we have the time to look elsewhere? I just don't trust your emperor. Sigurd suddenly opened his eyes and looked at him. I still trust you a little more. The problem is, as long as you are not emperor, it is useless no matter how much I trust your sincerity. It is not up to you to make decisions in the Qin kingdom. Fan Xian's expression was very serious. I indeed do not have the ability to make the decision to have the emperor give up on his determination to start a war. If you anger me, at least I can make the decision to have the Qin kingdom destroy your Dongyi. He stood up and said, don't try to incite internal strife in the Qin kingdom. Don't try to have my most respected elder sink into danger. Otherwise, there will be no agreement in my heart. Sigurd didn't say a word for a long time. Suddenly, he said, if such a day truly came, would you still have the heart to think about Dongyi? These are all things that haven't happened, but this kind of threat is an alarm that can be sounded ahead of time. Sigurd looked at him and said, did you also use such a crude method to force the female emperor of Northern Qi to shut her mouth? Fan Xian was not worried that the little emperor's gender would be leaked by Sigurd. The collapse of Northern Qi was not a scene this great grandmaster wanted to see. Straightforwardly, he replied, I have found that I can only use a crude method to solve these problems. This is what I learned from you. "Don't try to use me or control me," Fan Xian said. His state of mind was in a mess. It was as if he had returned to the old Fan manor in Jingdo many years ago and he was talking to his father. From the moment he came to this world, each of his actions and thoughts appeared to be free. In reality, they had always been shrouded in countless shadows. His father, the Emperor, Chen Pingping, and all of the old men were arranging his future according to what they thought was correct. Later, there were a few more monsters among these old men, such as Ku He and Sigurd on the bed. They all wanted to use what had happened in the past to secretly control him. If Fan Xian was not Fan Xian, his life would probably be much easier. As long as he continued to walk at a fixed pace, he would be able to live happily. However, he did not want this. Even if Yi Qingmei's name always shrouded his head, he still did not want it. After 2 days, the two major diplomatic groups from Qing and Northern Qi finally slowly and solemnly arrived on the road. After the two diplomatic groups left the Song Kingdom, they began a vigorous race at low speed on the road. It seemed that neither wanted to be the first to step onto Dongyi's territory and launch the first wave of political attacks. The head envoy of the Northern Qi diplomatic group, Wei Hua, faintly felt that it was strange, but he could not change anything. He guessed helplessly that Fan Xian had probably long arrived in Dongyi. However, the officials of the Board of Rights in the Qing diplomatic group had no idea that the Northern Qi negotiator who had arrived early in Dongyi was their emperor. The welcoming ceremony in Dongyi was very lively. However, it was hard to avoid a number of problems in the middle. Because all of the officials in the manor of the master of the city had died, the officials Yun Jilan had recruited from various territories acted hastily. These details all fell into the eyes of the officials of the two diplomatic groups. Immediately after, they learned of the murder that had happened in the manor of the master of the city. They involuntarily looked at each other, unsure of what had happened. In reality, the true negotiations had ended long before the diplomatic groups entered the city. The true major figures of both sides had already exchanged blows countless times in secret. They had already set down a solid foundation for the ownership of Dongyi. On this day, the spring sunshine was bright and beautiful. On this day, in the courtyard where the Qing diplomatic group lived, the officials of the Qing kingdom were dumbfounded. They looked at Sir Fan Jr., who sat at the head of the table. They were so shocked that they could not speak for a long time. Of course, they knew that Sir Fan Jr. had entered Dongyi ahead of time. But they could not have imagined that Sir Fan Jr. had used only 3 days to beat back the aggressive offensive of the Northern Qi people, convince the proud and aloof Sword Saint Grandmaster, suppress the opposing forces in Dongyi, and help the Qing kingdom settle this matter. After hearing Sir Fan Jr.'s words, all of the Qing officials became excited. If it weren't for the Dongyi officials outside, the cheers would probably have broken through the roof and rushed into the blue sky above Dongyi's head. The Qing kingdom was born from blood and fire. From a small country on the edge, it had developed into the most powerful country in the world. It had relied on endless conquering of the borders and endless wars. Particularly 20 or 30 years ago, the emperor had personally led an army to conquer the north and the south. Only then was he able to conquer the Qing kingdom's present territory and power. The words, conquering the borders, had long become a part of the blood of the Qing people. Regardless of whether it was corrupt officials or honest officials, peddlers and pawns, or scholars, they all passionately hoped that the Qing kingdom could unify the world. However, 20 years ago, the three major powers in the world had stood together. The Qing kingdom had been quiet for too long. The enthusiasm for conquering the borders had been suppressed for too long. After the Dong Mountain incident, knowing that the two great grandmasters of the enemy countries were no longer an obstacle, all of this enthusiasm exploded forth. Dongyi was added to the Qing kingdom's territory. This was not conquering Nanzhao or invading the grasslands to the west. It was also not fighting back and forth with Northern Qi to carve out a bit of land. It was truly conquering a large power. Other than the emperor's 3 personal expeditions to the north, which had shattered the Wei kingdom and established the Qing kingdom, being able to conquer Dongyi was, without question, the most glorious stroke in the Qin kingdom's history of conquering the borders. All of the officials looked at Fan Xian like they were looking at a god. Their eyes were burning with passion. Without wasting a single soldier and just relying on negotiations, they were able to obtain such great benefits for the Qin kingdom. They could no longer find any words to describe their feelings. They even thought that the emperor truly had foresight and was prepared to make Sir Fan Jr. a king 2 years ago. Sir Fan Jr. had accomplished such a great deed. Even if he didn't split the land, he would not be able to escape being made a king. For a moment, the slightly old vice minister of the Board of Rights found it difficult to digest this shocking piece of good news. He was so excited that his face flushed red. A gurgling sound came out of his throat and blocked the phlegm in his mouth. He watched as Fan Xian collapsed. Fan Xian walked out of the unusually lively diplomatic mission, but there was not a trace of joy on his face. Logically speaking, to be able to convince Sigurd, subdue the northern Qi emperor, and use this relatively peaceful method to bring Dongyi into the territory of the Qin kingdom was certainly the greatest thing he could do in his life. But, he still could not be happy. He knew what kind of danger was hidden behind Sigurd agreement. He had already told the officials in the diplomatic mission that the person responsible for the details of the negotiations on Dongyi's side was the first disciple of the Sword Hut, Yunjilan. Yunjilan's position in this matter had long been known to everyone. Sigurd had chosen him to come out to negotiate. Without question, he wanted to use an unyielding attitude to obtain the greatest benefit for Dongyi. Fan Xian did not care about this. Whether it was actual rule or submission in name was not a problem he needed to consider this year. After Sigurd death, Dongyi did not have much power to oppose. As for whether it would not change for 50 years or 5 years, that was the emperor's decision. Thinking of this, his mood became gloomy again. The secret report to Chengarden had long been sent out. The shadow, who had sunk into silence the entire time, had also been sent to the Jiangnan Palace treasury to be treated. However, Fan Xian had no confidence in whether or not he would be able to calmly digest this matter. Walking out of the gates of the diplomatic mission and getting into the carriage, Fan Xian leaned against the window with a headache and looked at the prosperity in Dongyi. This prosperity did not appear artificial because of the arrival of the diplomatic mission from the two countries. It also did not appear desolate because of the collective deaths of the officials of the manor of the master of the city. The merchants' courageous nature in pursuit of profit made them appear unrestrained and incomparably free. The black carriage came to the end of Chang Street. There were 3 directions. The member of the Qinian unit driving the carriage asked, "Commissioner, where do we go now?" "To the seaside," Fan Xian replied quietly. The carriage took a long time to pass through Dongyi. It avoided the busy transport groups and headed in the direction of the busiest port. It came to the quietest silver beach outside of Dongyi. The official driving the carriage jumped down and led it to the side of a beach. Suddenly, he realized that there was already someone on the beach. Furthermore, he acutely sensed the other party's identity. His pupils constricted abruptly. Lowering his voice, he said, "Northern Qi." Fan Xian had already stepped down from the carriage. Looking at the members of the Qinian unit beside him, he smiled and said, "I came today to find these Northern Qi people." This member of the Qinian unit was the one Fan Xian had met in Qingzhou last autumn. Fan Xian had no doubt about the loyalty of these trusted aides. Under Wang Qinian and Deng Ziyu's training, these trusted aides only knew Fan Xian. Perhaps they didn't even care about the one in the palace. He had a meeting with someone, so Fan Xian did not bring the 6th Bureau swordsman of the Overwatch Council. He only brought this trusted aide. The member of the Qinian unit was stunned. Very cleverly, he did not ask any more questions. He led the carriage to a quiet place and waited under a green tree branch. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. Stepping on the soft sand, Fan Xian walked step by step toward the seaside. There were a few people by the seaside looking at the sea. The waves of the East Sea were calm and gentle. They gently lapped against the silver sand, painting it with different shades of wet color. Paired with the circle of rocks not far in the sea and the layers of green trees behind the beach, it looked very beautiful. Fan Xian raised his hands and bowed seriously. "Greetings, Sir Lang Tiao." Lang Tiao looked at him calmly. His hands hung naturally by his side. His two curved knives hung by his side in chains, swaying gently in the sea breeze. He looked at the young man in front of him. His emotions were complicated, but his expression was unusually calm. A moment later, he opened up the path to the seaside and walked toward the distance of the beach. Fan Xian walked to the side of the young man wearing a plain robe and full of scholarly aura. Putting his hands behind his back, he looked at the sea with him. Sea Lily wore a beautiful light yellow dress. Like a fairy, she smiled as she accompanied the two of them. The young man was the young emperor of Northern Qi. Northern Qi had completely lost the Dongyi matter. He could not leave the court in Shangjing and the throne for too long. He had to leave today. In the diplomatic group, the officials of the Qing kingdom had been excited and worried that Northern Qi would sabotage them. At the time, Fan Xian did not reply because he was about to meet the Northern Qi emperor. The Northern Qi emperor's sword-like eyebrows remained straight. His eyes were clear and determined. No one would be able to see that under his clothes, he was a woman. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian. Suddenly, he raised his right arm and pointed at the vast sea. In a particularly firm tone, he said, "If I were a man, would certainly be able to unite the world and conquer this sea." The waves suddenly grew and crashed into the rocks in the distance, stirring up a thunderous sound and swallowing up the Northern Qi emperor's words, which were full of confidence and dissatisfaction. Chapter 647. In the blink of an eye, the waves on the shoreline expressed their anger toward the rocks and longing for the sand. The sound of the waves was like thunder, and they were shaped like snow. Without touching the clothes, they retreated, leaving behind a patch of peace. Half the eyes were blue sea, and the other half were blue sky. Fan Xian heard her words clearly and couldn't help smiling bitterly. "If I were a woman, would certainly be much happier than I am now." He knew that the little emperor had too much dissatisfaction and unwillingness in her heart. As a person of the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian didn't have many opportunities to experience the little emperor's imperial schemes and power plays. After so many years of private interactions, he knew that although the Northern Qi emperor was younger than him, her will was particularly mature. Her methods of doing things were unusually cold and heartless. Perhaps the dragon chair was indeed an incubator that could turn people into strange creatures? From birth, the female emperor beside him had been raised as a man. The process of her growth had been a completely abnormal process. Even now, she had not become a pervert. Instead, she had become a slightly cold, ambitious, and particularly unwilling emperor to the arrangements of fate. It should be said that the Northern Qi Empress Dowager was truly an extraordinary figure. Thinking of how he had thought there was a big problem between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor and wanted to use this to wedge himself into Northern Qi court politics, in the end, he had helped this mother and son cover up, got rid of Shenzhong, and subdued Shang Shanhu. Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his heart. His admiration for this mother and son grew stronger and stronger. Woman? The Northern Qi Emperor placed her hands behind her and looked at the boundless ocean in front of her. A glimmer of mockery rose to the corners of her lips. In this world, women are all accessories to men and are forever in a position to be dominated. If you truly became a woman, you would probably cry endlessly in your blankets every night. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, "Do you loathe your identity as a woman?" "Correct," the Northern Qi Emperor said coldly. "If my body wasn't that of a woman, how could I be threatened by you?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that this female emperor's heart was indeed a bit like a heartless man's. Everything she thought about was power and country. She lacked much of the gentleness he had imagined. The two of them fell into silence at the same time. They stood side by side and looked at the sea with their hands behind their backs. Not far from them, Sea Lily, dressed in light yellow, was holding a delicate little paper umbrella in one hand. She crouched down slightly and was picking up seashells on the beach. It was unclear whether or not her attention was on the two of them. The tips of Fan Xian's brows rose slightly. He thought of the seaside in Danzhou 3 years ago when he and the emperor had stood on a wooden plank and looked at the sea. At that time, white waves had risen from under their feet. Now, he was once again looking at the sea side by side with the Northern Qi Emperor. Putting aside the change of time and the flow of time, just these 2 times looking at the sea was enough to explain many problems. After struggling and working hard for a long time in this second life, he finally had an influence that others could not have in Northern Qi and the Qing kingdom. The Northern Qi Emperor's expression was cold. His straight, sword-like brows appeared particularly calm. His clear eyes had a sense of keeping strangers away. His not-so-long eyelashes rested calmly on his eyelids. The diplomatic mission has already arrived in Dongyi. I must return. She suddenly looked forward and said, I must admit that I have taken the risk to come south this time and have not obtained any benefits. I am very disappointed. What is there to be disappointed about? At least you didn't kill me. The world hasn't fallen into chaos. Fan Xian looked at her expression. For some reason, he felt a faint sense of pity in his heart. It was just like that crazy night when he saw her cry crazily. He knew that this emperor, who was female and had a man's heart, had not lived a happy life. Quietly, he said, although you are the monarch of Northern Qi, you cannot change what has already been decided. The Northern Qi Emperor's voice was slightly sharp. Using a harsh and bitter tone, she said, for example, I am a woman. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He wondered how the conversation had turned to this again. Shaking his head, he said, it is very difficult for one person to change the entire world. This has nothing to do with gender. In a cold voice, the Northern Qi Emperor said, but, in my view, the most spectacular losers in the world these 30 years, the most stunning losers, all happened to be 2 women who refused to accept the arrangements of fate and stood out bravely. How do you explain that? How did he explain it? Fan Xian was completely unable to explain it. One of those 2 women was his mother and the other was his mother-in-law. As a child, he could reminisce, be sentimental, and bear grudges, but he could not explain it. He opened his mouth and said, my mother's failure was because she was too kind. The eldest princess's failure was because she was too sentimental. The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him calmly and said with a smile, in reality, the reason is simpler than you say. It is just that you don't dare to say it. Putting aside the eldest princess, wasn't the reason that terrifying mistress of the Yi family had failed because of that man? Fan Xian would not continue this topic in front of her. Quietly, he said, today, when your majesty leaves, I hope you will tidy up the court and support the people. As for other matters, it is best not to act rashly. Before you become the emperor of the Qing kingdom, don't ever hope that I will count on you for anything, the Northern Qi Emperor said. The Northern Qi Emperor said, this has nothing to do with trust. It only has to do with the power of one's words. That day, Siga Jian took us through Dongyi. You should know what it was for. Fan Xian sighed and said, he took me to talk about the past, the future, to see Dongyi, and to deepen our feelings. It was all for this. Dongyi is not the Qi kingdom or the Qing kingdom. This city is too special. If Siga Jian wishes to preserve the uniqueness of Dongyi after his death. The little emperor turned her head and looked at him. He can only hope that you can become the emperor of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, do you think that is possible? This is precisely why I look down on you. You are in a dilemma, unable to advance or retreat. You have no idea what you need to do. The Northern Qi Emperor turned her head and mockingly said, "If you are truly a saint like Master Zhuang and don't want the people of the world to sink into the flames of war, then you can't just sit around and do nothing. You are doing your best to mend things, but you are unable to change the fundamental nature of the situation. In the end, you can only end up with a tragic end. You should know without me saying how wretched your end will be." On the contrary, Fan Xian smiled and said, "It looks like you finally believe I have the potential to be a saint." The Northern Qi Emperor was silent for a long time. She then slowly said, "Other than being forced to believe you are a saint, I can't think of any other reason why you would do these things." If Fan Xian only saw himself as an official of the Qing kingdom and single-mindedly helped the Qing kingdom unify the world, now that Dongyi had been subdued and he grasped the greatest secret of the Northern Qi royal family, there were too many things he could use and too many powerful moves he could use. However, he didn't do anything. He was just like the little emperor described, running around tirelessly sewing and mending, forcefully suppressing all possible disasters into the darkness of the Overwatch Council. "I don't want to be a saint, nor do I have the ability to be one." Fan Xian tiredly lowered his head. "I have just become much braver than before. I am willing to follow my own thoughts and change some things I don't want to see in this life." The Northern Qi Emperor gazed at him and smiled. "Even if you have to pay with your life?" "No," Fan Xian said straightforwardly. "My own survival is the most important. My family's survival is the second most important. Innocent people's survival is the third most important. If that day truly comes, I think the only person in this world who has the power to kill me will not be able to kill me." "Why? Because he is your father? Or is it because he knows there is a temple behind you?" A strange light flashed through the little emperor's eyes as she slowly asked. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Your Majesty does not have a shred of respect or fear for the temple." Then, he closed his mouth and didn't explain anything more. There was no need to let the Northern Qi people know of the emperor's fear of Uncle Wu Zhu. "I have questions about your earlier words." The sea breeze blew against the Northern Qi Emperor's determined face. It didn't move her non-existent bangs or make her feel any sense of weakness. "You think that your own survival is the most important. Then, let me ask you, if the person being compared was Princess Chen, would you still think your own survival is the most important?" Fan Xian was silent. The tablecloth in the Qing temple, the paintings, the ancient legends, the white-clothed girl hiding under the table and eating a chicken leg, the snow on Tsang Mountain, the medicine at their first marriage, the crying in the carriage, and the usual silence rose in his heart. Suddenly, a powerful feeling of remorse surged in his heart. Raising his head, he said seriously, "Of course, her life is more important than mine." "Minister Fan?" "Yes." "Your children?" "I'm not sure." "The Fan family's aunt-disciple?" "Yes." "Chen Pingping?" After a long silence, Fan Xian gently nodded. The Northern Qi Emperor smiled and looked at him. "You truly are a strange person. You are so protective of an old cripple, yet you don't have the courage to risk your life for your own woman. They are still young." The expression in Fan Xian's eyes was somewhat empty. For things like feelings, other than bloodline, there is also the problem of time. The Northern Qi Emperor was silent for a long time. "It looks like even if I had a child with you, I would not be able to completely control you." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "Actually, we are very similar people, cold-blooded and heartless. It is just that you are a woman and I am a man." "Heartless?" "Your words earlier almost made me think you were a saint who cared for the people of the world." "Didn't Sigurd Jian say that saints are heartless?" "He didn't say that." "I don't want to argue about this." The little emperor suddenly glanced at him and said, "You are my first man and my last man. Although I don't like that feeling, I don't mind having a child for you." "I also don't mind." Fan Xian's smile was somewhat mysterious. "Of my 3 great wishes in this life, one is to have many, many children. He suddenly changed the topic and said, as for the last man, don't say such nonsense. You are an emperor. As they say, after eating the marrow, one will yearn for the taste. I dare to bet that once you grow up and firmly control the northern Qi court, there will certainly be a lot of medicinal dregs in Shangjing's harem. The northern Qi emperor did not understand this joke, but she understood the meaning. Her face paled slightly. Her anger flashed and was immediately hidden. Coldly, she said, "Do you think I am a pervert like you?" Fan Xian shrugged and said, "Who knows? No one would dislike the pleasure between a man and a woman. As for the matter of having children, you didn't get pregnant that summer in the ancient temple. Perhaps you won't get pregnant this time either. I don't like men." The little emperor stared at him. At this moment, Si Lily, who had been standing silently by the side, walked over and stood beside the two of them. Her brows were gentle and she didn't say a word. The little emperor wrapped her arms around Si Lily's waist and looked at Fan Xian. "I like women. These are my women. This kind of thing doesn't scare me. Your Majesty doesn't know that the two men I admired the most in the past, one was surnamed Zhang and the other was surnamed Kai. They both liked men." Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders and looked at the two women beside him. Their temperaments and appearances were completely different. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He raised his hand and very quickly swept it across the two people's chins. Moistening his fingertips, he quietly said, "You are both my women. That is enough." The little emperor furrowed her brows as if she was not used to the frivolity by the seaside. Slightly angry, she said, "Don't be presumptuous. What about me? Do you think I will believe you when you say you don't like men in front of me?" Fan Xian looked at her calmly. "You've been acting for 20 years. It's been hard on you. Don't act in front of me anymore. I don't like men." The little emperor looked at him calmly. "I chose you because you were born beautiful, more beautiful than a woman." With these words, Fan Xian had lost. He had lost wretchedly. The northern Qi emperor smiled slightly and said, "Of course, other than being as beautiful as a flower, you also have other benefits. I once said why I chose you back then. Presumably, Duo also thanked you for writing a biography for her boudoir, but..." She furrowed her brows and said, "I still don't understand how you discovered my secret." Si Lily leaned against the northern Qi emperor's side and looked at Fan Xian with her large, expressive eyes. Presumably, she was also filled with curiosity about this matter. There was the fragrance of golden osmanthus in that old temple. Later, I learned from the great Wang Fei that this kind of golden osmanthus was only grown on the mountain behind Shangjing Palace. In the entire world, only the emperor would use this kind of fragrance. Fan Xian quietly told the story. The northern Qi emperor's brows furrowed even tighter. No matter what, she found it difficult to believe that it was this faint fragrance that had exposed her secret. "Of course, your Majesty's passion for the story of the stone is a bit excessive." The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. Bao Dai's story is one of the best tools for determining gender. "I still don't believe it," the northern Qi emperor said coldly. The northern Qi emperor coldly said, "What kind of secret is this? How could you think in that direction based on these 2 points? I admit that you are the most intelligent person in the world, but..." Before she finished speaking, Fan Xian already understood what she meant. Any investigation into a secret needed a primer. For something that no one had ever dared to think about, naturally, no one would doubt it. The little emperor still did not understand how Fan Xian dared to think in that direction. He stood on the seashore and laughed happily. His laughter traveled along the waves and traveled very, very far. "Do you know who Zhu Yingtai is? Shakespeare's lover? Mu Wanqing? Prince's coffee shop? A pregnant female bishop? A young boy and girl? Fan Xian looked at the two perplexed women beside him and said in a loud voice, "That is Harita Maki, my favorite." After a bout of laughter, Fan Xian stood by the seaside and immediately felt comfortable. His talent in martial arts was not as good as Haitang and 13. In terms of politics, he could not catch up to the emperor. He was not as good as his father-in-law at cultivating disciples. In terms of scheming, he was far behind Chen Pingping and even Yan Bingyun. He was not as patient as his father. He was not as determined as Ku He. He was not as clear as the little emperor about what she wanted. He was not as good as Siga Jian, who could see all things as ants. There were too many exceptional people in this world. Fan Xian was not much. The only thing he could rely on was his own hard work. However, in this second life, he was so successful and stood in his current position. It was because his mother had come to this world in advance, and he was the same. He also had a lifetime's worth of knowledge that the people of this world did not have. This was the source of his courage and the foundation of his confidence. Lang Tiao stood on a large tree by the seaside. The tips of his feet stepped on the treetop. As the sea wind blew, he floated gently. The two curved knives by his side made a clanking sound. He narrowed his eyes and looked calmly at the seaside. He didn't hear clearly what the emperor and Fan Xian had said, but he heard clearly Fan Xian's wild and somewhat arrogant laughter at the end. The three people by the seaside knew that it was not just Lang Tiao. Perhaps there were other powerful figures, such as people from the Sword Hut, who were secretly watching this conversation. However, they were not very worried. They faced the ocean. There was no one on the ocean. Fan Xian's hand held the Northern Qi Emperor's hand and then Sea Lily's. Calmly, he said, "No matter which one of you is pregnant, don't forget to tell me, the father." After these words were said, the Northern Qi Emperor's expression darkened. He glanced at Sea Lily. Fear floated onto Sea Lily's face, but she was not very afraid in her heart. If one were to look from behind, Sea Lily was leaning against the Northern Qi Emperor's side, while Fan Xian was standing on the other side. The three of them did not appear small against the backdrop of the blue sea. On the contrary, there was a sense of warmth. That night, a heavily guarded but unmarked group left Dongyi. Other than those in the upper echelons, no one knew that the Northern Qi Emperor and Imperial Consort Li were in this group. The Northern Qi Emperor had bravely come to Dongyi with the determination to cut off all means of retreat and try to find the last chance of victory for his country. In the end, he returned gloomily. Other than receiving Fan Xian's nonchalant words, he had gained nothing. Of course, for a woman, even if this woman claimed to like women, to be able to have such a night and such a beautiful beach in this absurd and dangerous imperial life, perhaps this would be a story that she would never forget for the rest of her life. To have this was actually enough, was it not? When the Northern Qi Emperor looked back at Dongyi in the dusk from the window of the carriage, was she thinking of Northern Qi's future or that man? The Northern Qi diplomatic group remained in Dongyi, but they had all given up hope. Although Dongyi still treated them with courtesy, everyone could clearly see that they had already begun negotiations with the Qing people. The details of the negotiations had been released through some unknown channel. The Qing kingdom's conditions were not harsh. For the merchants and commoners of Dongyi, they were unexpectedly relaxed. Other than the vassal states that were about to send their hostages into Jingdo and sink into a gloomy fog, the reactions of the commoners were rather normal. Of course, they would be sad and disappointed, just like Yunjilan. However, there was no overly intense opposition. The negotiations were still ongoing. The implications of this matter were too great. Even if they had to talk for an entire year, it was completely necessary. Thus, the secret message sent from the Jingdo palace was not overly hurried. On the contrary, the Qing emperor told Fan Xian not to rush. His words were filled with comforting and encouraging words. Fan Xian was not in a rush. He had talked for a number of years about that beautiful city in the south, much less today's situation. He just wandered the streets in Dongyi and meditated by the seaside. Occasionally, he would drink tea with 13th Wang and repair their relationship. His entire behavior was not like that of a powerful official of the Qing kingdom. Rather, he was like an idling Dongyi person with nothing to do. Time passed in a flash. Fan Xian had been in Dongyi for almost a month. He finally stepped into the sword hut again to see the great grandmaster who had been injured by the shadow and was bedridden. P.S. Today's chapter was very annoying to write about. Women are too difficult to write about. They also have to make everyone's appearance and personality different. Furthermore, it is easy to attend to one and lose sight of the other. It is too exhausting. I've decided that the next book will have at most 4. As for the different colors of the sea in yesterday's chapter, it refers to the human heart being like the sea. The depth is different, but it is all very complicated. Chapter 648. Dear readers, please give me some face. Please do not attack the books that other authors have worked so hard to write. This is something I have always cared about. The order of the monthly votes is very interesting and intense competition. It is actually beneficial to one's mental and physical health. Please do not get angry and hurt each other's feelings. That is not good. Please be peaceful, do not be lascivious, and do not hurt. Thank you very much, very much. I don't understand how you can keep holding on. There was no one else in the room in the sword hut. It was very quiet. Fan Xian sat on a chair by the bed and quietly said to the skinny old man on the bed, "You've held on so hard." Why? Fan Xian was still somewhat afraid of this great grandmaster. Otherwise, given his sharp nature under his gentle appearance, the words he would have said would have been even harsher. Although Sigurd was already at the end of his rope, he was still afraid that the skinny old man on the bed would suddenly become a large sword and ruthlessly hack toward him. Sigurd lay on the bed and looked upward with soulless eyes. Although his breathing was not rushed, it was unusually deep. It sounded like a broken bellow, giving one the feeling that the flame in the furnace was about to go out. This was exactly what Fan Xian did not understand. Sigurd had clearly been hit by Yi Liuyun San's hoe and the Emperor's way of the Emperor's punch on Dong Mountain. His life had long been extinguished. He didn't know what method he had used to be able to struggle at death's door for 3 years. However, a month ago, after being stabbed twice by the Shadow's thunderous sword, this great grandmaster finally could not hold on any longer. The Zhenqi in his meridians had completely dissipated, and he had become a piece of dead wood on the bed. Fan Xian could clearly sense the pain and price Sigurd had paid to forcefully extend his life. He didn't understand. Since living was so difficult and the agreement had already been reached, why did Sigurd continue to use the pure life-saving Zhenqi in his body to forcefully drag on? Sigurd body was already very skinny. In this month's battle with the Netherworld, he had used up a lot of energy. He had lost nearly 10 kilograms. His entire body's flesh had withered. His skin was almost sticking to his bones. He looked terrifying. The sound of laughter rang out from the bed. In a raspy voice, Sigurd said in a low voice, "There is no reason for life and death. I don't want to die yet, so I want to live." Fan Xian looked at him calmly. After confirming that he was already paralyzed in all 4 limbs, he couldn't help but sigh. Standing up, he said, "Logically speaking, your disciples have injured me many times in the past. Of the 100 tiger guards you killed on Dong Mountain, many were trusted subordinates whom I wanted to protect. For some reason, seeing you about to die, I don't feel much of the joy of revenge. Because, you know that those tiger guards were killed by your emperor through the sword in my hand." Sigurd breathing gradually calmed. His words also gradually became steady. Only his eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, could no longer condense the sword light that had once dominated the world. They were cold and slack. Fan Xian paused for a moment and then respectfully asked for guidance. I really want to know how you've survived these years. Sigurd was silent and didn't speak. Fan Xian walked forward and stood by the bed. He gently lifted the blanket and carefully pulled back the soft, light clothing covering the great grandmaster's body. Looking at the large wound on his chest, he didn't speak for a long time. This was a rude and disrespectful action. No one else in the sword hut saw it, but Fan Xian still felt that his action was rude and inappropriate. He only glanced at it before carefully pulling the clothing on Sigurd body into place. A great grandmaster on the verge of death could only have Fan Xian look at him like he was examining a corpse. Presumably, Sigurd should feel angry in his heart. Strangely, Sigurd gaze did not change at all. He only looked at the beam above his head. No one knew what he was thinking. Fan Xian sat back in the chair and began to carefully think back to the wound he had seen earlier. The reason he was interested in Sigurd wound was because he truly didn't know how this great grandmaster had extended his life by 3 years. He knew that the true cause of Sigurd death was the punch the emperor had landed on his body. Even if he was a great grandmaster, the meridians in his abdomen had all shattered, and his organs had all rotted. How could he have survived? In the manner of the master of the city, when the shadow had tried to assassinate Sigurd Fan Xian had caught a glimpse of the strange wound on the great grandmaster's abdomen. The wound was suffused with a terrifying green light. This green light was a color Fan Xian was familiar with. It was the color of poison. Fan Xian sat in the chair and was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said, "How long did Sir Fei stay in Dongyi?" Sigurd smiled with difficulty. A moment later, he quietly said, "Actually, you are smarter than you think." Fan Xian sat woodenly in the chair and said, "To use a strong poison to cut off meridians and freeze rotten flesh, this kind of mysterious method of using poison is not something everyone can do." He sighed and gently rubbed his temples. "I once heard Sir talk about this kind of realm when I was young, but I never thought that someone could actually do it. Of the 3 great grandmasters who use poison in the world, Xiaofan is dead. I know the one in Dongyi was made up by you. Although he had some skill, other than Sir Fei, who else could truly use poison to let you live a few more years? Furthermore, he always told me that he was going out to sea. If he didn't leave from Chuanzhou, he would leave from Dongyi." It was as if Fan Xian was talking to himself. In a quiet voice, he said, "He cured you back then. It is not too surprising that he has come to cure you again." Sigurd body was frozen on the bed, unable to move at all. Coldly, he said, "Fei Jia stayed in the sword hut for 1.5 years and then went out to sea." A sense of confusion suddenly rose in Fan Xian's heart. When he saw Sigurd injuries in the manner of the master of the city, he had already become suspicious. He had thought that Sir Fei Jia was still quietly hiding in the sword hut. He had not thought that he had long left. After he had been reborn into this world, other than his grandmother and Uncle Wu Zhu, his 2 relatives, Sir Fei Jia was the first elder he had met and the first person to wholeheartedly love him. Although he was a strange person, Fan Xian and Fei Jia had not spent much time together. The 2 of them were particularly close. It was a kind of intimacy forged through corpses and poison. Sir Fei Jia had truly gone out to sea. He would probably never return to this land again. Fan Xian's heart suddenly felt cold. A faint sorrow welled up. He thought of how his father, Chen Pingping, and even the emperor might all leave him one by one, leaving him alone in this world. This was a sorrow that was difficult to bear. Fei Jia and Yi Luyun went out to sea together. Sigurd revealed another secret. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. After Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun had only recovered from his injuries for 2 months. Then, just like in the past few decades, no one knew of him again. Not even Yi Zhong and Yi Ling knew. However, the Qing people were all used to this great grandmaster's carefree life, so no one cared too much. Going out to sea? To a new land? Fan Xian smiled bitterly with difficulty. Everyone left quite straightforwardly. Yi Luyun was stabbed by me on the mountain. It is impossible for him to return to his original level, Sigu Jian said calmly as he lay on the bed. Sigu Jian lay on the bed and spoke calmly. There was not a trace of pride or ruthlessness. Fei Jie followed him out to sea and could take care of his injuries. Yi Liuyun's hands could protect Fei Jie. These two old things live quite freely. Fan Xian stood. After a moment of silence, he gazed at him and said, "The negotiations between the Qing kingdom and Dongyi are still continuing. As you know, this matter cannot be settled in a short amount of time. The nobles of the vassal states will certainly still retaliate. You are about to die. You won't be able to control these problems. When the time comes, I may be ruthless. This has nothing to do with me." Sigu Jian's small and thin body was buried under the blankets. He appeared very pitiful. "You're telling me this, cough, cough, are you leaving?" "I need to make a temporary trip back to the capital and then come back to deal with the follow-up matters." Fan Xian nodded and walked toward the door. When his feet suddenly stepped on the doorstep, he suddenly said, "Just what message did Chen Pingping have Fei Jie bring you?" It was like Sigu Jian had fallen asleep and did not reply. Fan Xian turned around at the doorstep. His eyes were full of worry. He continued to ask, "Ku he wants to prolong Chen Pingping's life, and Chen Pingping wants to prolong your life. Why must you old people suffer so much? Sometimes, I truly cannot believe that the old director would choose such a path. It is not in line with his sense of beauty. I am also very surprised." Sigu Jian laughed in a very ugly way. "That old dog has clearly always been loyal to the Qing emperor. Why would he help me protect my life? Is he not afraid that I will slaughter through the hanging temple?" Fan Xian didn't open his mouth to speak. He thought darkly in his heart that the things that the old cripple was thinking of were just using human nature. What a wretched and painful plan this was. 3 years ago, before the Jingdo rebellion, the director was poisoned. Fan Xian suddenly lowered his head and said, "That person was someone from Dongyi." After saying this, he walked out of the room. He walked out of the lifeless room filled with murderous intent. He stood beside the large pit in the middle of the sword hut and raised his head to look at the sky. He was silent for a long time and didn't speak. White clouds floated in the sky. The round and bright sun was at the end of the long clouds. It looked like a burning brush drawing an eye-piercing picture in the blue sky. Burning itself to illuminate others. The universe was originally dark, but its eyes could not tolerate any darkness. It furiously burned the fuel from the beginning of time, wanting to illuminate all of the darkness hidden behind the stars. Fan Xian stood beside the sword pit and took a deep breath. The two circulations in his body slowly moved. Tianyi Dao's Jinqi protected his heart and meridians. He raised his tyrannical true method to the highest realm. The Jinqi in his body was abundant. It surged until his clothes flapped loudly in the windless environment. A seemingly endless stream of Jinqi flowed along his arms and into his steady palms, slowly being released. This was a method of circulating Jinqi. Not everyone knew it. It was a useless method Fan Xian had thought of to climb the cliff. However, he had practiced it for 20 years and was very familiar with it. The Jinqi was released and moved according to his will. It was very natural. It was an interesting idea. Who would have thought that many years later, it would have such an effect? Fan Xian stood beside the sword grave with his arms spread out in both directions. The countless swords in the pit began to jingle. It was as if they felt the call of this Jinqi and began to tremble endlessly. A simple sword was the first to be unable to withstand this kind of power. The tip of the sword cried out sorrowfully and broke free of the yellow earth at the bottom of the pit. The scrap of paper and trash that Sigu Jian had thrown in flew up and into Fan Xian's hand. Fan Xian looked calmly at the sword in his hand and compared it to the sword of the Wei Emperor he often used. He found that it was indeed not eye-catching at all. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly and say, "It's also fate." On the bed in the darkness of the room, the dying great-Grand Master Sigurd smiled and said to himself, "It's still not enough." Fan Xian looked at the sword in his hand and sighed. "It's still far from enough." In the darkness of the night, 3 carriages headed west as fast as they could. The group of carriages carried the honored guests of the Qin kingdom. Under the current situation, no one dared to stop these carriages for inspection within the territory controlled by Dongyi. Thus, the group of carriages moved quickly. Furthermore, the color of these carriages was black. Mu Feng carefully poured a basin of hot water and placed it in front of the commissioner. He was terrified that as the carriages moved forward, he would spill the water. Fan Xian's daily life could be considered luxurious. He didn't know where these Overwatch Council officials obtained hot water. He scooped up a scalding towel from the basin and forcefully wiped his tired face. "Is there any news from Jingdo?" "Everything is as usual," Mu Feng replied quietly as he glanced at him. He didn't know why the commissioner was in such a rush to return to the capital. Although the negotiations with Dongyi were troublesome and he needed to return to the capital to hand the details of the negotiations to the emperor to decide, why did he have to make the time so tight? He even had to take the risk of traveling at night. Fortunately, there were no mountain roads near Dongyi. Otherwise, if the carriages flipped, no one would be able to bear the responsibility. The emperor would probably execute all of the Overwatch Council officials accompanying him. Hearing Mu Feng's reply, Fan Xian's mood relaxed greatly. It was now the 10th year of the Qin calendar. It had been 5 or 6 years since he had officially entered the Overwatch Council. More accurately speaking, from the day he was born, he had been raised by Chen Pingping in preparation to take over the Overwatch Council. At the age of 5, other than learning poisons from Sir Fei Jie, he had spent most of his time studying the Overwatch Council's regulations and organizational planning. Now, Fan Xian had firmly grasped the terrifying organization that was the Overwatch Council. He had his own judgment of his subordinates' loyalty and abilities. The black carriage moved forward silently in the dark night. Although the oil lamp in the carriage was windproof and shockproof, the light still flickered. Fan Xian rubbed his tired eyes and raised them. Suddenly, he calmly said, "Xiaofan, you are Mu Tai's distant nephew, right?" Mu Feng paused. He thought that Sir had long known of this matter, but he still replied respectfully, "He is my uncle, but there has never been a 3rd generation. If someone wanted to kill Mu Tai, what would you do?" Mu Feng jumped in fright and stared at Fan Xian in a daze. For a moment, he couldn't say anything. Fan Xian smiled and said, "I'm just giving an example. How about this, if Mu Tai and I had a grudge and he wanted to use his death to incite your hatred toward me, would you kill me because of this?" Mu Feng repeatedly shook his head and didn't say a word. Fan Xian shook his head in boredom and sighed. He then lowered his head again, thinking, how could there be such a stubborn person in this world? As Fan Xian moved forward through the night and returned to Jingdo to explain the Dongyi matter in detail to the emperor, the northern Qi emperor had already returned to the quiet Shangjing. The intersecting black and green eaves of the palace were still as beautiful as ever. Although she had left the royal palace for a while, with the Empress Dowager's powerful suppression and the cooperation of trusted officials in court, no one had discovered anything unusual. In comparison, the northern Qi royal family, which had long been thought by the Qin court to be at odds with mother and son, was actually as united as a metal plate. They knew much more clearly than the Qin kingdom. The northern Qi emperor stared in a daze at the dark night outside the palace. She turned her head to glance at the beautiful woman reading a book behind her. Suddenly, she asked, "You and Fan Xian were only in the room for an hour. Was he in such a rush? Or were you in the throes of love and unable to control yourself?" After returning to the palace, although the little emperor's favor toward imperial consortly had not decreased, the sharpness in her words could not be stopped. Sea Lily had grown up with her, so of course she knew what kind of person she was. She had endured for half a month without explaining, but today she smiled and said, "Your Majesty, I know you are jealous. There is no need to show it so obviously." When Fan Xian had said those words, the little emperor's expression had become ugly. After hearing Sea Lily's words, she couldn't help but huff coldly. Sea Lily stood up, walked behind her, and rested her cheek on her thin shoulder. She wrapped her arms around her and gently caressed her belly. Her breath smelled like orchids. Fan Xian's words are simple. If you're pregnant, then of course I'm the only one who's pregnant. No matter which one of us is pregnant, we have to tell him as a father. The little emperor fell silent and suddenly said, "I wonder if that pretty boy is having a good time in Dongyi." Sea Lily didn't reply. She only thought that Sir Fan Jr. was the most dashing man in the world, but he had caused so much trouble. He was probably caught in the middle and would become the most troubled man in the world. The most troubled man in the world finally returned to Jingdo with great difficulty. The black carriage quickly passed through the double checks of the Jingdo garrison and 13 city gate guards and came to the gates of the royal palace. Chapter 649. 3 years ago, there had been chaos in the palace in Jingdo. A large number of the masters in the palace had died, but the relationships in the palace had become simpler. The overall atmosphere had become much more solemn and direct. The empress had died. It looked like the emperor had no intention of making a new empress. The empress dowager had died. There was no longer an old woman sitting high up and watching over the concubines. Lady Shu had indifferently accepted the result of her son's death. She only ate vegetarian food in the cold and cheerless palace. The emperor not banishing her into the cold palace could already be considered exceptionally merciful. In the palace, the women with the most power to speak were the third prince's mother, Yi Gui-pin, and the great prince's mother, Lady Ning. These two concubines had both been injured in the palace rebellion. They had formed a blood-stained friendship in the battle. They worked together to handle matters in the palace and could be considered very harmonious. As for the matter of passing on the throne, which could affect the atmosphere in the rear palace, it could not cause any major problems at the moment. Although the emperor had not chosen another crown prince, everyone knew that the prince most likely to take over the Qing kingdom was the third prince, Li Qingping. Although the third prince was still young, only a 13 or 14-year-old youth, the only two elder brothers who could threaten his position were the great prince. Everyone knew that the great prince did not have the slightest intention of coveting the throne. Furthermore, he had the blood of a Dongyi female slave girl in his body. This made it naturally difficult for him to inherit the throne. There was also a potential competitor, which was Fan Xian. However, Sir Fan Jr. was, after all, an illegitimate child. Furthermore, he was the third prince's teacher. Most importantly, looking at what had happened these years, Sir Fan Jr. had no interest in that throne at all. As for whether or not Fan Xian had any interest in the eyes of the officials and concubines in the palace, that was a question worth pondering. At least for now, the third prince's path was bright. The support at his side was real. The path of the entire Qing kingdom was clear. Thus, the atmosphere in the royal palace was good. Small, united meetings were held every day. Everyone's spirits were filled with a sense of striving to improve. Fan Xian traveled the entire way. By the time he returned to Jingdo, it was already dusk. After he entered the depths of the palace, the entire sky had darkened. He sat in the imperial study and rubbed his slightly bulging stomach. He couldn't help but frown, thinking that he should have gone to Xinfeng restaurant to get some buns before entering the palace. This was just a wonderful idea. He had the emperor's heavy responsibility. Since he was returning to the capital to report, how could he dare to linger outside the palace? Just as he was feeling annoyed, he suddenly saw two young eunuchs carrying a meal box into the imperial study. No one knew where the emperor was eating dinner in the palace. Even if the internal court notified him that Fan Xian had returned to the capital, he would not be able to rush over. Fan Xian looked in a daze at the food in the box. He smiled and said, "You know I haven't eaten." Eunuch Yao usually followed at the emperor's side. The head of the eunuchs on duty outside the royal study was also someone Fan Xian was familiar with. It was Eunuch Dai, who had performed a great service in the palace coup. Eunuch Dai looked at Fan Xian with a wide smile and said, "You are anxious about state affairs. Presumably, you have missed your meal. Pick some refreshments first. The emperor is eating in the back palace at this time. Even if I wanted to reward you with a bowl of fish roe rice, I'm afraid it would be too late." Fan Xian did not stand on ceremony. He began to attack the food in the box. As an official, sitting in the royal study when the emperor was not present was a crime punishable by execution. To eat in the royal study without asking for an edict was even more disrespectful. However, he had long received a special edict, so he sat calmly and ate without worry. To the side, Eunuch Dai smiled and thought, in the end, Sir Fan Jr. was not a normal official. Immediately after, he thought of the matter that had been spreading around the world recently. Eunuch Dai's heart heated up again. Sir Fan Jr. had performed a great service for the Qing kingdom. He didn't know how the emperor would reward him. The reason this head of eunuchs felt hot was because he knew that most of his future was in the emperor's hands. The other half was completely connected to Sir Fan Jr. His life in the palace had always been smooth sailing. It was not until Fan Xian appeared that he began to suffer misfortune and rise again. Because he had contributed greatly during the Jingdo rebellion, he was now the deputy head eunuch. His status was even more noble than when he had been in Lady Shu's palace. Occasionally, Eunuch Dai would think with lingering fear that if he had continued to be on duty in Lady Shu's palace, he would probably already be a member of the Cold Palace or even long dead. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glance behind him out of the corner of his eye. The eunuch following him had once been a popular figure in the royal study. It was a pity that he later served his master in the Eastern Palace. Although he hadn't done anything wrong, his status had already plummeted. Fan Xian put down his chopsticks and said a few warm words to Eunuch Dai. Only then did he slowly turn his gaze behind him. He looked at the increasingly steady young eunuch, whose acne was still clear on his face. Calmly, he said, "You still haven't died. That is somewhat unexpected." Hongzhu's face was full of respect. He bowed toward Fan Xian and replied, "I have received the emperor's favor and came out of the Cold Palace at the end of the year. In the future, remember to serve the emperor more attentively." Fan Xian said these words without much emotion and then closed his mouth. Eunuch Dai could see that his mood was not very good. He casually said a few words of flattery and then led Hongzhu out of the royal study. He thought to himself that there had always been rumors in the palace that Eunuch Hong and Sir Fan Jr. did not see eye to eye. Back then, it was Sir Fan Jr. who had kicked this kid to the Eastern Palace. Looking at it now, it was indeed so. He couldn't help but laugh coldly 3 times in his heart. He thought to himself that even with old Eunuch Hong watching over Hongzhu, he was still no match for the little duke's hand that reached in from outside the palace. Now that Eunuch Hong was dead, Hongzhu's position in the palace was very awkward. Eunuch Dai completely did not notice that when he left the royal study, Fan Xian and Hongzhu met each other's eyes. There was mutual concern in their eyes. Then, they gently and imperceptibly nodded their heads. It was completely silent in the royal study. Fan Xian silently sorted through the thoughts in his mind. It was expected that Hongzhu would come out of the Cold Palace. This kid had always been well liked by the nobles in the palace. In the rebellion, it appeared that Hongzhu had no knowledge of it. It was expected that he would be used. Of course, in this matter, Fan Xian had gone around many twists and turns and helped Hongzhu put in some effort. As for the entanglement of the 3 years, Fan Xian had already stopped thinking about it. At least, this little eunuch had helped him too much. In terms of affection, it was he who owed him and not the other way around. Just as he was thinking this, a wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the royal study. The faint light of a lantern came from the other side of the glass window, illuminating the night and floating toward them. Fan Xian quickly pulled back his stretched arms and stood to welcome the emperor. The door to the royal study was pushed open. The Qing emperor, dressed in a bright yellow robe, walked in with large steps. His slightly thin face was calm. Only the white hair at his temples revealed his true age and how much energy he had expended these years. The group of serving eunuchs did not enter. Cleverly, Eunuch Yao closed the royal study's door tightly from behind. Only the emperor and Fan Xian were left in the royal study. The emperor sat comfortably on the soft couch and rubbed his knees with both hands. Looking at Fan Xian, he suddenly laughed out loud. Fan Xian was confused by this string of laughter and stood awkwardly where he was. The emperor shook his head and said, "You're very good." Since he was very good, why did he shake his head? Fan Xian laughed bitterly and took out the box of secret memorials that the council had prepared and placed it on the low table in the middle of the soft couch. The emperor opened the box and began to read it carefully. Inside the box were the preliminary results of the negotiations between the Qing kingdom and Dongyi, as well as the Overwatch Council's analysis of Dongyi's bottom line, the territory map that Dongyi had presented, and the detailed situation of the distribution of people and finances. The Dongyi matter had long shocked the entire world. The diplomatic group responsible for the negotiations, including Fan Xian himself, maintained a daily exchange of the details of the negotiations with the royal palace in Jingdo. The emperor knew the details of the negotiations very well. After all, the two places were very far apart. If he wanted to truly grasp the first-hand situation, he would need Fan Xian to return to the capital and make a face-to-face report. The emperor slowly put down the file in his hands and stood. Walking to one of the walls of the royal study, he pulled open the curtain hanging on the wall. Below the curtain was a large map of the world. On it was clearly drawn the roads of each province. Even the coastlines to the east and south were drawn in great detail. This map not only included the territory of the Qing kingdom but also the territory of northern Qi and Dongyi. The first time Fan Xian had truly entered the royal study to discuss matters, he had sat with the ministers and scholars. He had seen this map and knew of the boundless passion the Qing monarch and officials had for expanding their borders. At that time, there had been 3 princes at the emperor's side. Now, 2 of them were gone. The emperor's steady palm moved across the map. Although the light in the royal study was bright, it was not the shadowless light in an operating room. Wherever his palm moved on the map, there was a patch of darkness. It was like a black arrow containing boundless authority, representing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and full of murderous intent. The palm landed above Dongyi and the surrounding vassal states and gently patted them. The emperor did not turn his head. Calmly, he said, "Without using a single soldier, I have this place. Fan Xian, how do you think I should reward you? The negotiations have not ended. There are still internal disputes in the Sword Hut. The nobles of the vassal states will probably still rebel. Most importantly, I don't know if it will cause a backlash from Dongyi in the future," Fan Xian replied with a smile. He could see that although the emperor's expression was calm, the joy in the depths of his heart could not be hidden. This emperor, who wholeheartedly wanted to unify the world and establish a legacy that would last for thousands of generations, had spent decades to finally eliminate Ku He and Sigurd, his 2 greatest opponents. He had taken the first step on a journey of tens of thousands of li. That kind of joy could not be faked. "How is Sigurd?" The emperor turned and smiled. He did not continue to raise the question of rewards. Instead, he asked about the matter he cared about the most. "His entire body is paralyzed. He will die within 3 months, without a doubt," Fan Xian answered quickly and without any hesitation. The emperor thought for a moment and then sighed quietly. He's going to die. However, I truly admire this sword fanatic. He took a blow from Uncle Lu Yun and a punch from me, yet he was still able to live for so long. The strength of this person's physical body is indeed the strongest of us. Naturally, these words excluded Wu Zhu. Fan Xian's eyes moved slightly. In a quiet voice, he said, "It is also fortunate that Siga Jian did not die. Only he can suppress the warriors in the sword hut. If he had not nodded his head, this negotiation would probably not have succeeded." The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. He still did not understand his son. Were these words putting in a good word for Siga Jian? What was the point in putting in a good word for a great grandmaster who was about to die? Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "In my opinion, this negotiation will probably last until next year. At that time, Siga Jian will have long died. However, since he has set the tone and spread it everywhere, presumably, the disciples of the sword hut will not dare to disobey. Will 13th Wang take over as the master of the sword hut?" The emperor suddenly asked. For this emperor, he did not care at all about Fan Xian and 13th Wang's personal relationship. What he cared about was that, in order to truly control the territory of Dongyi, the master of the sword hut had to be someone he could control. The young disciple of the sword hut, 13th Wang, had deep ties with the Qing kingdom. Regardless of his abilities, he had to be someone he could control. Fan Xian's heart tightened. His mind spun quickly. The opening ceremony has been delayed by a month. No one has said anything. However, I have not found out who Siga Jian is planning to give the sword hut to. There is no need to find out. The emperor's expression darkened. If Dongyi is truly willing to submit, the master of the sword hut must be appointed by me. Regardless of who Siga Jian chooses, if I don't nod my head and seal, then it cannot be done. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. He had been worried that Siga Jian would forcefully reveal the Shadow's identity and have him become the second master of the sword hut. Now, it looked like he should be worried about something else. The emperor's actions were very similar to how he had appointed the head of the lamas. Thinking about it closely, it made sense. Even if the Qing kingdom sent officials and soldiers to Dongyi in the future, in the hearts of the Dongyi people, the true masters were still the disciples of the sword hut. This should be clearly written in the agreement between the two countries. The Qing kingdom would not make any major changes to the structure of Dongyi within 50 years. If the Qing kingdom didn't even have the power to appoint and dismiss people in name, how could Dongyi count as submitting? I will make this clear to them after I return to Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't think further and agreed straightforwardly. As long as the sword hut lowers its head, there is no need to consider the businesses of the other small countries, the emperor said with narrowed eyes. The emperor narrowed his eyes and said, if Siga Jian was smart enough, he wouldn't do anything before he died. If he was truly an idiot, I would give him a profound lesson. When the emperor was angry, blood flowed under heaven. The lesson the Qing emperor spoke of was to brazenly send out troops and forcefully conquer Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't continue this topic. Straightforwardly, he asked, if the sword hut is decided, what about the manor of the master of the city? Weren't the people in the manor of the master of the city killed by Siga Jian? The emperor stood by the map and suddenly looked deeply at Fan Xian. Actually, it isn't just me who is curious. Other than feeling great joy, all of the officials in court are also shocked. And Siga Jian, that old thing, had a special liking for you. Who would have thought that he would actually be able to suppress his wild nature and agree to your request? Before he left for Dongyi, Fan Xian and the emperor had argued for a long time in the palace. In the emperor's opinion, even if Siga Jian died, he would not allow Dongyi, which he had guarded for so many years, to surrender to the Qing kingdom without sending out a single soldier or firing an arrow. Fan Xian insisted on his own opinion and used a long time to convince the Qing emperor to let him try. The problem was, he had succeeded on the first try. This reality surprised all the officials in the Qing court. It also made the emperor very happy and even faintly uneasy. His illegitimate child had truly given the world too many surprises. There was doubt and suspicion in the emperor's gaze, but Fan Xian seemed to not feel anything. He smiled bitterly and straightforwardly said, "I don't dare to claim credit. If it weren't for the fact that the Qing kingdom is strong and powerful, Dongyi would only have two paths after Sigujian's death. They would not have lowered their heads and submitted to the Qing kingdom." These words were true. Any diplomatic negotiation was rooted in the foundation of power. Perhaps Northern Qi had the power to contend with the Qing kingdom for many years. However, Dongyi was established as a merchant and was not at all firm. It was like duckweed in the water or a light cloud in the sky. As long as a strong wind blew, it would scatter like duckweed. Under the pressure of the Qing kingdom's powerful national and military power, Dongyi didn't have much of a choice. Fan Xian's success this time was actually the Qing emperor's success. Under his rule was a particularly powerful kingdom. Fan Xian suddenly took a deep breath and said, "As you know, my mother came from Dongyi. Sigujian has some feelings for me." He knew he couldn't hide this from the emperor. He didn't want to hide it, so he might as well say it directly. As expected, the emperor clearly knew about Yi Qingmei's past in Dongyi. After hearing these words, he only smiled slightly and said, "As expected. What requests does Sigujian have for you?" Fan Xian raised his head and said seriously, he hopes that the Dongyi under the Qing kingdom's rule will still be the Dongyi of today. "I allow it." The emperor waved his hand decisively. Without waiting for Fan Xian to say anything, he straightforwardly said, "The Dongyi I want is the present Dongyi. It has become like Jiangnan. What do I want it for?" Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. The problem he and Sigujian were most worried about was not a problem at all in the emperor's heart. What the emperor wanted was the present Dongyi, a Dongyi with a faint sense of self-rule by merchants that carried out large trade deals with overseas. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel boundless admiration for the emperor. Only an emperor with great foresight could tolerate such a situation. The emperor's will and vision were probably broader than he had imagined. Immediately after, the emperor and Fan Xian discussed the details of bringing Dongyi into the territory, as well as the problems that could appear, and related countermeasures. It was gradually getting late, but the lights in the royal study remained bright. The map of the world gradually changed as the father and son discussed it. After a long time, the emperor rubbed his tired eyes and turned his head back to look at the map again. The map of the world had already changed, but this map had not. The emperor quietly said, "I'll be making a new map tomorrow." "Congratulations, Your Majesty," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. At this moment, the emperor finally smiled. His palm suddenly slapped heavily on the top of the map. It was a large piece of foreign territory that had been painted green. The bright yellow clothes seemed to carry an unstoppable sense of determination. There is only this piece left in the world. Fan Xian's heart suddenly tightened. The emperor raised the question from earlier for the second time. "Anji, how do you think I should reward you?" In history, there were many examples of people who had done too much to shock the ruler and died a horrible death. When these examples were unlucky, it was often because of this sentence. Because their contributions were too great and they had already received too many rewards, there was no reward to be given. It was impossible for the person on the throne to give half of the throne to these examples. Thus, without exception, the examples all ran down the road to death. Occasionally, there were examples who jumped out and successfully rebelled, but they were in the minority. Hearing this question, Fan Xian did not feel any fear at all. He only pulled a long face and sank into thought. His contributions this time were not great. Based on what he had said earlier, Dongyi's submission was ultimately because of the Qing kingdom's strength. He was just a primer, an excuse Siga Jian used to convince himself. As for his contributions being too great to shock the ruler, forget it. The emperor's self-confidence and narcissism were the first in 1,000 years. In his life, he had never worried about which official or son would be able to surpass him. A powerful emperor would have a strong tolerance towards the people under the dragon throne. However, Fan Xian did indeed have the third problem of the examples. It was the problem of having no reward to give. He was already a first-rate duke and sat in the two great treasuries of the Palace Treasury and Overwatch Council. The power in his hands was 1/3 of the world. What more could the emperor reward him with? Was it really as the people in the diplomatic group secretly guessed that he would be made a king? However, he had to ask for a reward. The entire world was watching Jingdo. If Fan Xian performed the greatest service but didn't have a reward he could take out, the officials would probably all feel bitterly disappointed in the emperor. After a long time, Fan Xian suddenly smiled bitterly. Looking at the emperor by the map, he scratched his head and said self-mockingly, "How about you give Dongyi to me?" Of course, this was a joke, a huge joke. At most, being made a king would be an idle prince of Donbua. If he actually gave Dongyi away, it would be splitting the land and making him a marquis. The emperor also smiled. However, his smile was not as amusing as Fan Xian had imagined. On the contrary, it carried an indescribable sense of mockery. It looks like Siga Jian is truly as he said on Dong Mountain. He wholeheartedly wants you to be the master of the city. Fan Xian's heart chilled. He smiled bitterly and replied, "In any case, the master of the city doesn't care. Let's change it." The emperor couldn't be bothered to continue his conversation. He sat down and picked up a cup of warm tea to slowly sip. Fan Xian stood in front of the emperor and had a headache for a long time. Probingly, he said, "But, someone has to be sent to manage Dongyi. How about we have a prince be the master of the city?" In the present Qing kingdom, there was only one prince, the great prince. He had Dongyi blood running through his veins and a noble status. Furthermore, if they wanted to subdue the hearts of the Dongyi soldiers and civilians, it would be an excellent move for the great prince to be the master of Dongyi. We will discuss this matter in the future. The emperor furrowed his brows. It was clear he was moved by Fan Xian's suggestion, but, more than that, he was worried. "I won't enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs," Fan Xian suddenly muttered. Fan Xian suddenly muttered, "Staying with those old men every day is so boring." The emperor smiled and said, "Sir, he is also in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, isn't he? He is also a young man." These words were just words. The emperor would not allow Fan Xian to give up the power of the Overwatch Council and enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs, destroying his plans for the future of the Qing kingdom. Hearing the emperor's words, the face of the hateful official who watched over Ruoruo every day outside the Donbua medical shop immediately rose in front of Fan Xian's eyes. He laughed coldly and said, "If your majesty truly wishes to reward me with something, I would like to ask you to grant me 2 edicts." Concerning the matter of the appointed marriage, Fan Xian and the emperor had been in a cold war for over half a year. The moment Fan Xian opened his mouth, the emperor knew what he wanted to say. He thought to himself, "How dare you use your achievements to ask for favors?" His expression became ugly. "1 edict for Ruoruo and 1 for Wuxia," Fan Xian said in a low voice. "Please allow them to choose their own husbands." The emperor looked at him coldly. A moment later, he suddenly said, "In the matter of Wuxia, I will allow you. But, I will not allow your sister's marriage." Fan Xian pretended to be angry, but his heart was calm. He knew that the emperor would never relent on this matter because the other party wanted to use this matter to completely suppress him. Unless he relented and used the relationship between father and son and the will of a ruler and official to plead with the other party would certainly not let it go. This was a fit of pique, but it was not just a fit of pique. The emperor wanted to completely control Fan Xian and have him completely lower his head in front of him. The emperor had always clearly felt that his son was different from other sons. He had too many traces of his mother. On the surface, his dead sons were incomparably respectful to him, but in secret, they were thinking of things that were lower than pigs and dogs. And Ji, on the other hand, had a glimmer of unwillingness to be honest seeping out of his bones. Although the emperor admired Fan Xian's absolute sincerity, he wanted to beat this sincerity into absolute loyalty. There is no need to speak of this matter again. The emperor stared at Fan Xian with a cold expression. He suddenly thought of something and smiled slightly. Just one edict from Wuxia is to reward you for today's work. It is indeed somewhat unreasonable. However, I remember that you are still only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew the meat of the show had come, but his face was one of confusion. In any case, that old dog Chen Pingping doesn't care. You can directly take over the position of director and let that old man have a good rest. The emperor looked at him with slight mockery and said, in your early 20s, I have given you the position of director of the Overwatch Council. It can be considered a great kindness. Why don't you quickly give your thanks? Fan Xian was indeed still only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. After all these years, under Chen Pingping's purposeful nurturing and delegating of power, he had long grasped the entire Overwatch Council. What difference was there between him and the director? Yet, the emperor was using such a natural and expected promotion to dismiss the merit he had made in Dongyi and block his thoughts of breaking off the marriage. It was truly ungrateful. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched. It was as if he was angry and wanted to say something disrespectful. In the end, he suppressed his emotions and gave a random bow, gave his thanks, and left the palace. The emperor smiled in the royal study and did not take offense to his son's rudeness. That night, Fan Xian returned to his manor. He did not immediately go to do the second thing. Through the conversation in the royal study, his mood had already relaxed. At least, the seemingly omnipotent emperor could not grasp the minute movements of the entire world. Furthermore, in the battle of tempers and personalities, he had won another battle. Sitting by the side of the bed, he soaked his feet in the scalding hot water to relieve some of his tiredness. Lin Wan's face was full of tiredness. She leaned against his shoulder and said, "You didn't even tell us you were coming back. The house was not prepared at all. The servants are all asleep, and you won't wake them up. I'll rest for a few days. I still have to go to Dongyi to take charge." Fan Xian gently held his wife's hand and smiled. "I'm too busy. You also don't know who gave you this name." Lin Wan yawned. She was clearly a woman who had given birth, yet her face still carried a childishness that was difficult to wash away. Particularly her round cheeks, it amused Fan Xian greatly. He gently pinched his wife's cheek and smiled. Other than that person, who would have such a tasteless name? Why are you in such a good mood today? Lin Wan suddenly made a sound. Fan Xian proudly said, "Today, I asked for a good official. Tomorrow, I will leave the city and go into the garden to chase people away. Did anyone see the happy headquarters yesterday? Tell me, isn't it normal for a middle-aged, vulgar man to like Lin Yichen? Ha 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 ha, one of my greatest wishes is to personally pinch the flesh on Lin Yichen's cheeks." Chapter 650. The large bed in the back of the Fan Manor was still soft. The pair of children were usually treated like little ancestors. At this moment, they were sleeping peacefully under the careful care of the nannies. No one would disturb the people in the main room. Fan Xian was indeed sleepy. He only said a few words to Wan, before he sank into the land of dreams. His feet were even soaked in hot water. Lin Wan sighed and rose to put on an unlined robe. She began to continue her work. Jingo was peaceful in the night. Most people had already entered He Tian's hometown. Only the emperor, who was unusually diligent, was still reading through the memorials sent from the 7 roads and provinces. Although these memorials had already been read twice by the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the emperor was used to scrutinizing everything under the heavens, so his workload was still great. The light in the royal study did not tremble at all, but the door began to tremble. Eunuch Yao led another plain-looking eunuch into the royal study without asking for permission. The emperor raised his head and glanced at the two of them. He furrowed his brows and said, "What did you find?" Eunuch Hong had died on Dong Mountain. Eunuch Ho had died during the Jingdo attack on the palace. The internal court eunuchs were all under Eunuch Yao's control. Although the power of the internal court was not great, because of its special position, its power could not be underestimated. Other than the defense of the palace, the most important responsibility of this department was the bridge through which the emperor secretly controlled the Overwatch Council. This was the Internal Affairs Bureau that had given the Overwatch Council headaches in the past. However, because of Chen Pingping's existence, the internal court appeared rather humble in the eyes of the Overwatch Council and could not be of much use. Later, the emperor had the Imperial Censorate begin to compete with the Overwatch Council. Thus, many people began to forget that the internal court had such a function. Eunuch Yao didn't say anything. He accepted the 2 files from the plain-looking eunuch's hands and placed them on the table in front of the emperor. The files were thin. There was certainly not much content inside. The emperor scanned them lightly. His expression changed slightly before immediately returning to normal. But it was this slight change that caused Eunuch Yao's heart to sink into ice. The emperor's expression did not change even when the eastern mountain collapsed in front of him. Under the siege of 2 great grandmasters, he still talked and laughed without fear. Yet, because of this thin piece of paper, he was moved. It could be imagined that the content inside had a great impact on the emperor's mind. The contents of the paper had nothing to do with the assassination in the floating temple. Even if it was related, it was only the later part. What the internal court had been investigating these 2 years was the whereabouts of the city-guarding crossbows produced by the palace treasury's 3rd workshop that winter. Those city-guarding crossbows in the valley on the outskirts of Jingdo had almost caused Fan Xian to die a tragic death. Later, the emperor and Fan Xian both found out that the attack was done by the Qin family, but these city-guarding crossbows were numbered in the name of the Dingzhou army. The emperor withdrew his gaze from the file and was silent for a long time without saying a word. It was as if he also did not understand this matter. That day, Fan Xian had been assassinated in the outskirts of Jingdo. As a ruler and a father, it was difficult for him to suppress his anger. No matter how he investigated, he could not find anything specific. It was not until today, after the internal court's painstaking investigation, that they discovered that there was a shadow in a wheelchair behind the matter. Other than being shocked, the emperor did not understand. Even someone like him could not understand why that old dog would do such a thing. Furthermore, it was clear that Nji did not know of this matter. Otherwise, he would not have gone through so many twists and turns to find a glorious and comfortable path of retreat for that old dog. The emperor rubbed his slightly tense brows and coughed gently. Picking up another file, he glanced at it and asked, "Did that person from Northern Qi also go to Dongyi?" "Yes." The plain-looking internal court investigator said respectfully, "The Duke of Danbo kidnapped the Northern Qi emperor into his hut. Afterward, they met privately by the seaside. As for what exactly they talked about, we were unable to find out." Fan Xian had not reported this matter to the emperor. The emperor looked at the paper and Fan Xian's every move in Dongyi recorded on it. His brows became slightly dark. A moment later, he said, "What else?" The knives that appeared in Qingzhou were indeed produced by the 3rd workshop of the palace treasury, but they were trial models. They had not yet been distributed to the military, so they could not have come from the military. The plain-looking eunuch continued, 3 of those knives appeared. In the end, we only obtained 1. Following the emperor's orders, we sent this knife to Sir Fan Jr. to give him a reminder. Looking at it later, it should have been the person on the grasslands who took the other 2 knives. It looked like he was helping the Duke of Donbua hide something. Xia Mingji and the second young master of the Fan family's cross-border goods have long been watched. They are all daily necessities. These knives shouldn't have come from this channel. Although Eunuch Yao was the head eunuch of the internal court in name, in reality, the internal court's investigations were directly answered to the emperor. Thus, this was the first time he had heard of this seemingly vague but, in reality, shocking news. His face was slightly pale. He knew that if the emperor truly believed the internal court's investigation report, Sir Fan Jr. would probably be in big trouble. The old man in the wheelchair would also not have many good days ahead of him. Contrary to Eunuch Yao's expectations, the emperor smiled coldly. You want to sow discord between the Qin kingdom and Enji with just 3 knives? After these words were said, Eunuch Yao and the plain-looking eunuch quietly met each other's eyes. They both saw the fear in each other's hearts. Everyone in the world knew that Sir Fan Jr. was the emperor's illegitimate child, but no one in the world could say this truth in front of the emperor. Yet, the emperor had brought this matter to light in front of these 2 eunuchs. That little guy in Shangjing is very interesting. The emperor smiled slightly. Using a little bit of Enji's kindness, he actually thought of such a thing. The eunuch swallowed and carefully said, Your Majesty, should we continue investigating? Continue investigating the matter of the attack in the valley. The matter of the Hanging Temple can also be investigated. The emperor closed his eyes tiredly. Don't investigate Enji's side. In the future, if anything leads to him, let it go. Yes, Your Majesty. The emperor closed his eyes and was silent for a long time. He didn't understand what role Chen Pingping had played behind his back. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He thought that perhaps Fan Xian's son knew about the role Chen Pingping played, which was why he was in such a hurry to take power by disguise. He believed in Fan Xian's loyalty, just like everyone else in the world. From the perspectives of profit, morality, and nature, Fan Xian would not betray him. The emperor had this confidence. Even if one day, his son learned of the story from many years ago, at most, he would only unleash a sorrowful anger at him and would not betray this country. The next day, there was rain in Jingdo. Fan Xian wore a black robe and walked through the rain. Behind him were the 3 members of the Qinian unit and a group of 6th Bureau swordsmen. Silently, they entered a small alley. After exiting the alley, they circled around and saw the narrow door of the manor. Every time he came to the Yen manor, it seemed to be raining. Perhaps the heavens also knew that the father and son living in this manor were some of the most powerful spies in the world. In the style of darkness and light, they maintained a distance from secular society. He felt some sympathy for them. Jing Chengzi Manor was still Jing Chengzi Manor. So many years had passed, but the Yen Manor was still so low-key. The emperor's rewards and the court's favor were all not displayed on the surface. Fan Xian took off his wet raincoat at the door. Without waiting for an announcement, he walked directly toward the rear courtyard. Before long, he saw the large fake mountain that blocked his view of the rear courtyard. The first time he had entered the Yen Manor, Fan Xian had noticed this large fake mountain. Although the building did pay attention to the pattern of covering the door and concealing the view, this fake mountain was too big, too fake, too abrupt, and too ugly. It was a 10-day break. Usually, Sir Yen Jr., who was always busy, had a rare moment of leisure. He was playing checkers with his wife. He and Lady Shen had been married for some time, but there was still no news from her stomach. However, Yen Bingyun was not worried. Looking at the situation, the entire Yen Manor was not worried. Seeing Fan Xian's arrival, a glimmer of surprise flashed across Yen Bingyun's face. He knew that Fan Xian had returned to the capital last night, but he had always thought that given the commissioner's laziness, he would either be playing Spring Sleepy in his room or going to Prince Huching's manor to compete in drinking with the great prince. He had not thought that he would come to his manor. When Sir Yen Jr. was young in Jingdo and later in Shangjing in disguise, he was a famous scholar. He was skilled in the 4 arts. However, in front of Fan Xian, he did not want to display any of his talent or interest. He was like a block of ice, strictly maintaining the division of superiors and subordinates. It was very boring. Thus, Fan Xian did not want to engage in recreational activities outside of official business with him. Every time Fan Xian entered the Yen Manor, it meant that something big was about to happen in the Overwatch Council. "I'm in a good mood today," Fan Xian said with a smile. Lady Shen curtsied hastily toward her husband's immediate superior and returned to the rear courtyard. Shen Zhong's daughter had always had the identity of a female fugitive from northern Qi. A few years ago, she had lived in the Fan Manor for a long time and had a good relationship with the women in the Fan Manor. In front of Fan Xian, she always felt complicated emotions. Naturally, she did not know how to get along. Although no one had ever said anything, Lady Shen knew that her father's death and the destruction of her family was not only because of the northern Qi royal family's indulgence and Shang Shanhu's murderous intent. It also had a lot to do with the young leader of the Qing Overwatch Council. Watching the woman's figure disappear into the room, Fan Xian's mood sank. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "How is the matter I talked to you about last time? If you want, I can help her get rid of her identity as a fugitive from northern Qi." Yen Bingyun stood up and stood in the corridor as if looking at the rain and thinking. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "Don't think that no one in the world knows about the shady business between you and the northern Qi people. In the past, it didn't matter, but what is the situation now? Once the 2 sides go to war, what you are doing is aiding the enemy. Instead of quickly washing yourself of it, you still want to use this relationship to gain some benefits. Don't think that just because your identity is special, no one will suspect you of treason." "Treason my ass," Fan Xian scolded laughingly. "Am I not also in a hurry to earn money? Besides, most of the money I don't have to spend myself. You've also seen the account sent to the Hangzhou conference and the River Works Yamen in the past. I don't understand this. In any case, you're giving this money to the court. Why do you have to make a detour in the middle? Most importantly, by avoiding taxes in the middle, the court gets even less money. Fewer procedures means one less bad experience of being skinned alive by officialdom," Fan Xian said. "Furthermore, I like to control these things myself. The palace must know about these things. The emperor has been enduring silently. You know why. Don't go overboard." Yen Bingyun couldn't resist reminding him. "The eldest princess can get it, but I can't," Fan Xian said. "The monk can touch, so can I. Why did you change the topic again? Are you willing to do what I asked you earlier? If you are, then I have to quickly send a letter to Shangjing. Her family is all dead. In any case, she won't return to northern Qi. Why care about that?" Yen Bingyun shook his head. "There will always be a day when one returns to one's homeland." Fan Xian smiled and patted his shoulder. "Find a quiet place. There are some important things I need to discuss with you." Yen Bingyun's expression immediately became serious. "Let's do it here. No one in my manor would dare to eavesdrop on anything." Fan Xian was silent for a moment and acknowledged the other's confidence. Yen Ruohai was a spy the Overwatch Council had placed in the military for decades. Yen Bingyun was also one of the most successful spies in the history of the Qing kingdom. Such a father and son pair would certainly have sharp eyes and would not allow an unreliable person to remain in the manor. "I am about to take over the position of director," Fan Xian said quietly as he looked at the drizzle sliding down the corridor. There was no expression of surprise on Yen Bingyun's face. Chen Pingping had long stopped looking at matters. There was no difference between Fan Xian and the director. As for whether or not he would immediately take over the position of commissioner, he did not care much about this matter. Since Fan Xian had spoken, after a moment of silence, he still said, "Congratulations." Fan Xian lowered his head and quietly said, "That is why I need you to quickly draw up a plan. I want to be a true director." Yan Bingyun's gaze froze and he stared at him quietly. It was as if he wanted to discern the other party's true meaning from his words. "Including your father, the bald head of the 7th Bureau, and even the old servant by the old cripple's side, their control over the council is far above what we can imagine." Fan Xian seemed to not feel his gaze and coldly said, "If I want to be a true director, I have to let the old comrades rest completely. These people must be kept out of council affairs." "You mean to have Director Chen completely break away from the Overwatch Council so that even if he wanted to extend his hand, he wouldn't be able to?" "That is exactly what I mean." Even with Yan Bingyun's calmness, he couldn't help but feel boundless shock. He stared at Fan Xian in a daze, not knowing why he would suddenly have such a thought. A moment later, he smiled angrily and said, "You want me to deal with my own father? It's a metabolism." Fan Xian smiled. "It has nothing to do with dealing. It's just separation." "I need a reason," Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I'll tell you a story about the wind and snow in the valley." After finishing the story, Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun. "I don't understand." Yan Bingyun's expression was rather ugly. The old director cherished him so much. How could he do those things? "I also don't believe it." Fan Xian lowered his head in pain. But, the emperor seemed to have found something. "If the emperor truly believed this and the old cripple really wanted to kill me, what do you think the conclusion would be? The emperor once summoned you into the palace. You are one of the 7 gentlemen in his heart. Qin Heng is dead, but there are still 6 of you young people. Help me with this and have the Overwatch Council truly fall into my hands." Sitting in the carriage heading out of the city, Fan Xian began to smile proudly again. Last night, he had tricked the emperor. Today, he had relied on his superb acting skills to trick Yan Bingyun. With this Overwatch Council official taking action, in addition to his conversation with Chen Pingping in a moment, presumably the matter he worried about the most would become a story that would never happen because of the Overwatch Council's complete reorganization. Behind the attack in the valley was the shadow of the Overwatch Council. If Yan Ruohai had not reported to Chen Pingping and cooperated with the Qin family, it would have been impossible for the Qin family's private soldiers at Shao Mountain and Qin Heng's concealment of the Jingdo garrison to calculate the path of Fan Xian's carriages from Jiangnan, much less launch such a fierce attack. If Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian, this alone was enough. Fan Xian had used this story to convince Yan Bingyun of his sincerity. He had also made Yan Bingyun believe that he had no intention of revenge. He only wanted to follow his old example of attacking the second prince and strike first, allowing the old director to retire peacefully. The reason he had to make such a detour was because of the matter of the shadow and Yi Qingmei. Fan Xian would not tell anyone even if he was beaten to death. He could not tell Yan Bingyun. He could not even tell his wife. "How many people in the world know that you once wanted to kill me?" Fan Xian sat in the quiet room in Chen Garden with a smile on his face. He listened to the babbling of a distant relative and looked at the elderly Chen Pingping beside him. Chen Pingping's expression was calm. He glanced at him coldly and said, "In order to force me to leave Jingdo, you're willing to do so." That matter was done by Yan Ruohai. Will Yan Bingyun investigate? I'm not hoping for him to investigate. I'm just hoping for you to quickly return home to find your first love. Fan Xian laughed loudly. You should know that starting tomorrow, I will be the director of the Overwatch Council. You are just a lonely old man who has retired early. What will you use to fight me? After these words were said, Fan Xian suddenly fell silent. He said heavily, "You promised me to let go at the beginning. You said you had thought it through, but you didn't, so I can only force you to leave. You bastard. Chen Pingping coughed as he cursed. I don't care about anything anymore, and you're still worried? Chapter 651. Canvassing for votes was really tiring, but I still had to do it. This was because monthly votes were like stubborn horses. If you didn't use all your strength, they wouldn't move forward. However, I was really out of words. I had to save the golden sentence for canvassing for votes for the last day. Of course, the main purpose of that sentence was just for fun. Speaking of which, what kind of attitude should I use to convince everyone to vote for me? I didn't know. Although I wrote a lot this month, it definitely wasn't a lot. It was just a bit faster for me. At the same time, it was naturally a bit crude. If I wanted to fight for feelings, I felt that after writing about the year of Qingyu for a year and a half, I was afraid that Xiaofan's feelings would be too mushy and I would write my proclamation for canvassing for votes into Qiangyao prose. The flames of war spread through October. Monthly votes were worth 1,000 taels of gold. The position on the monthly votes list was dangerous. Those at the front were at a disadvantage, and those at the back were greatly frightened. After thinking about it, I could only sincerely say, I need monthly votes. Those who are willing to vote for me, please help me out. Chapter 652. One person's sorrow could not make the entire Chen garden fall. The sorrow on Fan Xian's face always made one feel it was mischievous and mocking. Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair and looked at the young man in front of him. He couldn't resist smiling. It had been 5 years since Fan Xian first saw Chen Pingping. During these 5 years, he had seen Chen Pingping grow old and silent. He had experienced the terror of this elder, but he had never realized that Chen Pingping's smile would one day appear so pure as a child's. For some reason, the dark aura that usually shrouded the wheelchair had long since disappeared. Today, Chen Pingping looked like a believer who had been a vegetarian for his entire life. His entire body exuded a refreshing and pleasant aura, as if he was transparent from the inside out. Fan Xian stared at his face in a daze. He knew that one's appearance came from one's heart, but he didn't know what kind of mental journey had made Chen Pingping become like this. The old man's eyes were slightly indifferent, but they were not the emotionless coldness. They were calm as he looked at Fan Xian lightly. Slowly, he said, other than that poison, what else is there? There's a lot more. We've talked about it before. Fan Xian sighed and stared into Chen Pingping's eyes. You had Sir Fei pass by Dongyi and did everything in his power to protect Siga Jian's life. From this point on, Fan Xian no longer used a questioning tone. Instead, he began to speak each word like he was stating a fact. He did everything in his power to prolong your life because he could see clearly that the longer you lived, the greater the chance of you and the emperor falling out. Fan Xian continued with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and continued, you allowed Siga Jian to live this long because you had long planned to have the sword hut reveal the shadow's identity and force the emperor to act against you. Force? Chen Pingping smiled as if he had heard an interesting word. Fan Xian was not moved by the old man's smile. He sighed and said, as for your poisoning 3 years ago, it seems very clear now. You used this to not enter the capital and allowed the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to mess around in Jingdo. Nominally, you were obeying the emperor's secret edict and letting the dogs into the courtyard. In reality, you had a bigger plan. He laughed at himself and said, I was in a critical situation at that time, so I didn't think too deeply about it. Only later did I understand. The eldest princess chief strategist, Yuan Hongdao, and the old Qin master's most trusted Overwatch Council spy, Yan Ruohai, were all your trusted aides. Although you were in the wilderness, you were clear about the situation of the rebellion. With these 2 people secretly helping you, if you wanted to help the emperor control the situation, Jingdo would not have fallen into such chaos. Chen Pingping laughed, his voice a little sharp. Then tell me, why didn't I control the situation? You wanted the situation to be a bit more chaotic. You wanted everyone in the palace to die. Fan Xian lowered his head and faintly said, "The emperor set a fire, but you allowed the fire to burn too brightly. Too many people died. You were hoping that in the end, when the world turned white, only boss and I would be left to clean up the mess. The problem is, there's one thing you haven't explained. Why did I betray His Majesty? Do I have the power to make it so that only you and Prince Huqing remain in Jingdou? You have this ability. I have never doubted this. If the emperor had actually died on Dong Mountain, Yuan Hongdao and Yan Ruohai would not have been able to be used at all. You would have directly abandoned Yuan Hongdao." Fan Xian looked at Chen Pingping and felt a strange taste rise in his mouth. It was slightly bitter and sour. "As for why you betrayed the emperor, you and I both know." Chen Pingping laughed and patted the arms of the wheelchair. It was like he was patting a strong diabolo in the wind, making a buzzing sound. He was silent for a long time. He stared fixedly into Fan Xian's eyes like he was staring at a similarly young person many years ago. Darkly, he said, "Shouldn't I?" Fan Xian was silent. He had no idea how to respond to this question. As a son, he couldn't say he shouldn't. He had always been shocked by Chen Pingping's bone-deep longing for Yi Qingmei and his desire for revenge that could burn everything. Chen Pingping was the emperor's closest official. Ever since he was young, he had served in King Cheng's manor. He and Yi Qingmei met very late and presumably did not spend much time together. It was because of this woman who was like a passerby in his life that the leader of the darkest special forces in the world hid a dagger in his heart for over 20 years. It pierced his heart and everyone's hearts. Chen Pingping suddenly lay back tiredly on the wheelchair and said, "You don't understand the past. You don't understand." Fan Xian had not personally participated in the events of the past, so he did not easily say he understood. He was silent, calculating, and enduring silently. He had no idea how to deal with it. If there was only hatred between people, perhaps this world would be much simpler. However, the relationships between people were always so complicated. "I also understand the second reason you took the poison." Fan Xian looked at Chen Pingping's eyes that were as still as an ancient well. Suddenly, his heart throbbed with pain. He felt that the matters of the world were indeed somewhat hurtful and hurtful. You had thought that the emperor would never be able to return from Dong Mountain. You have also destroyed his kingdom. You have been ruler and official for a lifetime. You should accompany him on the road to the Yellow Springs. You can consider it fulfilling your duty as ruler and official. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and said, "After all, I have watched the emperor grow from a child to an emperor. I understand him too well. He is someone who is afraid of being alone. I am worried that he will be afraid on the road to the underworld alone, so I want to accompany him." "Accompany him?" Fan Xian's voice became harsh. "He has killed enough people. There will be many people accompanying him on the road to the Yellow Springs. Do you need to be like this?" He calmed his emotions and said in a heavy voice, "Furthermore, he is not dead. It is always very difficult for a person to die." For the first time in front of Fan Xian, Chen Pingping sighed and said these words. Looking at him, he slowly said, "I have never underestimated the emperor. Before and during my plans, I have always been cautious and prepared for all possibilities of failure. Even if I failed, would not leave behind anything that could be used against me or drag you down." Fan Xian looked at Chen Pingping. A powerful feeling of worship suddenly rose in his heart. He was too familiar with this old cripple. There were many things that he had not hidden from him. Thus, he knew more about what Chen Pingping had done than the emperor in the palace. In this world, Chen Pingping was probably the only person who could secretly plot against His Majesty and hide it from His Majesty. The founder of the Overwatch Council was truly too powerful when it came to scheming. He was so powerful that he did not have to purposely weave anything. He just went with the flow of the world and occasionally smeared a few dark colors. He had once caused the emperor and the Qing kingdom to sink into a situation that could be beyond redemption. However, the emperor's own strength was too powerful. He was powerful to the point where he could easily tear apart all schemes and schemes. However, Chen Pingping was truly powerful. Even so, he still did not reveal any tiny loopholes. He had even arranged an escape route many years ago. Chen Pingping did not care about life or death. What he cared about was Fan Xian's safety after his death. That was why, starting from the Hanging Temple and after the shadow accidentally stabbed Fan Xian, he began to arrange everything, including the attack in the valley and even the matter in the palace. He was cutting off Fan Xian and Fan Xian. Even if it came to light in the future, these things that were hidden in the depths would become a cleavage between Chen Pingping and Fan Xian. In front of the evidence that he had painstakingly found, the emperor would believe that Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian and that Fan Xian had nothing to do with Chen Pingping's matter. As for why Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian, that was a question for the emperor to ponder. Fan Xian had been heavily injured in the Hanging Temple incident and almost died. The valley was also extremely dangerous. These two pieces of evidence were too powerful. Fan Xian could feel Chen Pingping's painstaking efforts. Looking at his old face and sensing the fresh air that rose from his heart was moved, but he didn't know what to say. Chen Pingping's expression was incomparably calm. You should have already thought through these things 3 years ago. That day, before the Chen garden recovered, you also said something similar. Why are you doing it again today? The emperor will always be suspicious, particularly after you played such a trick in Dongyi, Fan Xian said. I can only come to clarify these things with you. The Dongyi matter was arranged 3 years ago. After I promised you to let go, I already let go, Chen Pingping said with a smile. I don't care. Since you want to let go, then be more thorough, Fan Xian said. The emperor has already made me the director of the Overwatch Council. You can completely retire. Retire? That would be no different from my current life. Fan Xian smiled strangely. You still dare to say such words in front of me? If you are not willing, even if I am the director of the Overwatch Council for another 10 years, the Overwatch Council will still be yours. Oh, no. Chen Pingping also smiled. The Overwatch Council is the emperor's. Oh, no. Fan Xian mimicked his tone and sighed. 20% of the Overwatch Council is the emperor's, 30% is mine, and the other half is yours. It will always be yours. Having been in the Overwatch Council for so long, Fan Xian knew the frightening degree of control the old cripple in front of him had over the Overwatch Council. The so-called Emperor's private special forces had long become his private organization under Chen Pingping's old hands. This was because the Emperor had never doubted the loyal dogs at his side. It was also because Chen Pingping's prestige in the Overwatch Council was too high. There were too many officials who swore loyalty to him. Fan Xian did not doubt one thing. If the palace issued an edict to deal with Chen Pingping, people like Yan Ruohai and the bald head of the 7th Bureau would not even think before standing behind Chen Pingping. Everything for the Qing kingdom? In the hearts of the Overwatch Council officials, perhaps the Qing kingdom was the emperor. In the hearts of the middle-level officials who truly held power, other than Chen Pingping, there was no one else. What exactly do you want to do? Chen Pingping asked as he looked at Fan Xian with an expression of admiration. This seemed to be a normal question, but it was also like some kind of change between the two Overwatch Council directors. Fan Xian suddenly hung his head dejectedly and said, "Before I came today, I had already seen Yan Bingyun. I had him begin to prepare to gather the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, as well as the 4th Bureau's branches in the various counties, and cut off all possibilities of you extending into the council. However, I know that if you don't pull back, just Yan Bingyun and I alone will not be able to do much. Have Yan Bingyun deal with his old man? Chen Pingping chuckled. That's not a bad move. Although, the old man he has to deal with will certainly be much more than he imagines. The old man he spoke of referred to the upper echelon of the Overwatch Council officials who were completely loyal to Chen Pingping. Fan Xian sat forward and gently held Chen Pingping's tightly furrowed hands. Let go. If you let go, why are you still holding onto my hand? Chen Pingping smiled slightly. You can try to cut off the hand I extend into the council. However, I can promise you that the old men are more powerful than you imagine. Those old men were the first nest of eggs the Overwatch Council had laid at the beginning of the Dragon Flag. They had countless disciples in the council. It would be incomparably difficult to clean out these old men. Fan Xian cursed in his heart. On the surface, he said angrily, you said that the two of us have gotten along well these years. We are no different from father and son. Is there a need to fight a battle with me at this time? The key question is, you still haven't convinced me. Why should I let go? Chen Pingping's gaze was very interesting. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, the Emperor has already begun to investigate the attack in the valley and the Hanging Temple matter. One day, he will suspect you. Even if he can't find any evidence, this matter is always dangerous. Furthermore, you know that the Emperor's personality has changed a lot ever since so many people died in the palace. If it had been in the past, he would probably have used lightning-fast methods the moment his suspicions grew. However, he has never done so. These words were true. The Overwatch Council was one of the powers the Emperor relied on the most. His trust in Chen Pingping was also an anomaly in the world. Once he discovered that Chen Pingping had other intentions in his heart, if it had been the Emperor of the past, he would probably have flown into a rage long ago. We've talked about this topic before. Chen Pingping nodded. The Emperor has some affection for me. Even if he has some suspicions, he can't bear to act directly. He would rather wait for me to die of old age. Yes, the problem is that you never die, Fan Xian nodded. It's fine if you don't die, but your heart doesn't die either. So, I can only ask you to leave Jingdo and return to your hometown to find your first love. Chen Pingping smiled and scolded. He then suddenly asked, if I don't retreat, what will you do? I will begin to act, Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, even if I have to make a mess in the Overwatch Council, I will still beat you down. With what reason? Of course, it is because I found that Director Chen's shadow was behind the attack in the valley. As a prince and the next director of the Overwatch Council, I attacked with hatred and wanted to put you to death, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, regardless of whether or not I can win in the end, the Emperor will always think that I have also found out about this matter and will watch me fight. In the end, he will issue an edict to chase you out of the capital. On one hand, it fulfills my wishes and fills my grudge. On the other hand, it protects your life and completes the affection between you two. Chen Pingping's grizzled brows rose. Thinking about it, you also used this matter to convince Yan Bingyun? Fan Xian nodded. Using a non-existent grudge to hide the true danger within. Chen Pingping thought for a long time and then nodded. You've improved a lot compared to before. Fan Xian smiled and said, I thought about it for a month. Knowing that the internal court had begun to investigate the valley matter, I thought of using this point. Chen Pingping smiled tiredly. He knew what Fan Xian was worried about and why he had to go through so much trouble to force him to leave Jingdo. Just as Fan Xian's heart had been moved earlier, this head of special agents, who had been alone and bitter his entire life, suddenly felt his heart become much warmer. I promise you, I will leave Jingdo. Chen Pingping gently patted Fan Xian's hand. Fan Xian was overjoyed and chuckled. He then said, this shouldn't be a problem. Once in the Hanging Temple and once in the valley. Both times, I almost died to your hands. No matter what the internal court finds, it will only be a footnote for you to quietly leave Jingdo. Thinking of when you charged into Chen Garden in a wheelchair and yelled at me, it was very interesting, Chen Pingping said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. At the time, he truly didn't understand why Chen Pingping wanted to do these things. It was only later when the eldest princess completely enlightened him that he understood exactly what Chen Pingping wanted to do and why he had been carefully preparing to completely sever ties with him. The Taiping courtyard murder case was done by Qin Yi, right? Fan Xian suddenly said. Chen Pingping glanced at him and lightly said, Qin Yi is only one of the emperor's dogs. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, in the end, the Qin family wanted to rebel because of my existence? Of course, you are Yi Qingmei's son. Chen Pingping smiled. Qin Yi, that old dog, had been hidden by the emperor for many years, but he understood the emperor's intentions too well. If the emperor planned on using you in an important position, then he would not have let you know the story from back then. Qin Yi was the only surviving loophole in that story. The emperor wanted to help you ascend the throne and preserve the relationship between you and your father, so he had to silence you. Qin Yi had to die, Chen Pingping calmly said. Thus, Qin Yi had no choice but to rebel. In the past, Chen Pingping had always insisted on not saying these things to Fan Xian. However, now that it had come to this, there was no longer a need to hide it. He no longer wanted to drag Fan Xian into the dirty water of the past. As expected. Fan Xian took a deep breath. The warm air of spring entered his lungs, but it burned his chest. Although he had long guessed these things, hearing Chen Pingping personally confirm it still made it difficult for him to suppress the burning. 3 years ago, you asked why the Qin family rebelled. Chen Pingping suddenly looked at him with great interest. Given your vision, you shouldn't be able to see so far. Who reminded you? Fan Jian? Father would never tell me these things. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. It was the eldest princess. This name came out of Fan Xian's lips. Chen Pingping also became quieter. His gaze looked at the green trees outside the window. Lightly, he said, that crazy girl was also a remarkable figure. She had no idea what had happened back then, yet she was able to guess the past from these details. Truly impressive. During the Jingdo rebellion, were you in contact with the eldest princess? Fan Xian asked a question he had hidden for a long time. At the time, the Overwatch Council's reaction was truly strange. Even if it was part of the emperor's plan to have Chen Pingping lure out the unstable elements in Jingdo, Chen Pingping's response was too strange. Particularly on the eldest princess's side, it seemed that she had never purposefully paid attention to the direction of the Overwatch Council. No, Chen Pingping said with his eyes closed. There are many things that do not need to be in contact. We only need to guess each other's intentions and goals. The most ingenious plan in the world is just a flash of inspiration without any warning. Once each person's intentions come together, once it falls on paper, it falls short. Concerning these things, you have to learn well from your dead mother-in-law, Chen Pingping said with a slight smile as he opened his eyes. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and nodded his head. Chen Pingping suddenly asked quietly, now that you know enough, what do you plan to do in the future? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, I don't know. Chen Pingping sighed with slight disappointment. Is there evidence? Fan Xian's voice trembled slightly. Even a little bit of evidence. There are many things in this world that do not need evidence. Only intentions are needed. I only confirmed that person's intentions a few years ago and confirmed my own intentions. Chen Pingping's words had some similarities to Siga Jian's way of the sword. That day, the army marched to the west. The emperor was near Dingzhou. Your father was also with the army. The Northern Qi army suddenly moved south. I led the Overwatch Council north to Yanjing. Yizhong was also moved to the rear of the Western Army. Chen Pingping only coldly stated a fact. Most importantly, your mother had just given birth to you and was weak after giving birth. Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. What about Uncle Wu Zhu? I still don't understand why he would leave his mother's side at that time. Someone from the temple came. Chen Pingping smiled slightly. An emissary appeared on the land. Although I'm not sure exactly where your mother came from, I can guess that she, Wu Zhu, and the temple have always had some connection. Furthermore, Wu Zhu has always been very afraid of anything related to the temple. Someone from the temple came more than once. It was at least 2 times. I know of 2 times. Chen Pingping sighed. Each time they came, Wu Zhu killed them. At that time, it seemed that the only people who could threaten your mother were the people from the temple. Wu Zhu did not allow those people from the temple to come within 100 li of your mother. So, Wu Zhu left. But, your mother still died. Died, at the hands of one of our own. Chen Pingping smiled strangely. He enunciated the words, one of our own, with a particularly heavy tone. Fan Xian also smiled. His smile was particularly sincere. He then stood up and patted Chen Pingping's shoulder. I had long guessed these things. It is only after hearing them from your mouth that I realized they felt so real. Alright, don't think about these things anymore. Chen Pingping smiled and asked, the chest should still be in your hands, right? Where is Wu Zhu? Fan Xian smiled somewhat bitterly. A moment later, he said, the chest is not here. Uncle Wu Zhu had business and left. Chen Pingping made a sound of acknowledgement. Once again, he did not hide his faint disappointment in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian suddenly asked with slight surprise, you knew, the chest was in my hands? Your father also knew, Chen Pingping said. That's why your father didn't know. Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. It took a long time for him to digest the shock in his heart. He thought of how his father, who had already retired, had done countless things for him in secret. Involuntarily, a glimmer of nostalgia rose in his heart. Once again, he patted Chen Pingping's thin shoulder and smiled. You want me to learn from the dead eldest princess. I think you should learn from my still living father. When it's time to let go, let go. When it's time to retreat, retreat. He placed his 2 hands on Chen Pingping's shoulders and used a little force. Leave the future matters to me. Chen Pingping smiled and didn't say anything. He only thought to himself that given this child's personality, he would probably continue to watch and endure. However, he didn't know how long he would have to watch and endure for. There were many bitter lovers in the world, and someone with Fan Xian's background was, without question, the most bitter kind. Thinking of this, Chen Pingping suddenly felt that his and Fan Xian's 20 years of hard work had not been in vain. At least, Fan Xian had grown up healthily. Furthermore, he had grown up quickly. It seemed that he had only spent 1 night. Regarding Fan Xian, it is truly very painful for me to write. Many times, I am thinking about what I would do if I were Fan Xian. However, I can't find an answer. Although the outline has long been decided, it is still very difficult to continue writing. I will try harder to think and think. Chapter 653. The sky had darkened in an instant, but there were still no tears. Fan Xian's expression was slightly dark. He half leaned against the window and looked at the mountain path and the well-protected green hills and wild forests on the outskirts of the capital. He was silent for a long time without saying a word. The black carriage followed the flat but undulating stone path and drove diagonally onto the official road, leaving the boundaries of Chen Garden. However, Fan Xian's expression did not relax. The Overwatch Council officials around him looked at the still handsome but particularly indifferent face by the window. They all felt a strange chill in their hearts. They didn't know what had happened in Chen Garden, what the old director and the commissioner had said, or why the commissioner's expression was so serious today. The carriage drove silently on the official road toward Jingdo. Along the way, it occasionally came across commoners entering the city or young men and women from the families of officials returning from a walk. These black carriages were like a silent warning light. When everyone saw them, they hurriedly moved to the side and made way for the black carriages. The commoners were naturally respectful toward the officials, but the young nobles, who were usually not afraid of anything, knew the identity and power these black carriages represented. The nobles in Jingdo had many eyes and ears. They knew that Sir Fan Jr. had rushed back to Jingdo from Dongyi last night. In this world, no one dared to offend Fan Xian. Even these young nobles, who had been trained to be incomparably arrogant by their hormones, could only restrain their qi and focus in front of these black carriages and not make a sound. Sir Fan Jr. was famous for being ruthless and arrogant. He didn't care which lady or duke stood behind these young men. 4 or 5 years ago, outside Baoyue brothel, Fan Xian had broken the legs of a dozen little brats. This story had long shocked the hearts of all the other little brats. Fan Xian did not notice the movement on the official road. He also did not look at the timid young men who had stopped their horses to the side. He only looked silently at the scenery by the side of the official road with an unusually heavy heart. In the past, guessing was just guessing and thinking was just thinking. His elders had never said anything to him, so he could temporarily pretend he didn't know any of this and was only preparing in secret. He could only treat it as an unconscious action and not from the bottom of his heart and torment for some clear goal. But now, everything was laid out clearly in front of him. He had to face the story of the past and make his own choice. At this time, the black carriage had reached a fork in the road. Not far ahead was the majestic city of the capital. On the left was a quiet and secluded road, hidden by the green bamboo forest. Where should they go? Turn left. Fan Xian, who was leaning against the window, narrowed his eyes and softly instructed. Mu Feng glanced at him and didn't dare to say anything. He made a hand gesture and the 3 black carriages quickly turned left into the bamboo forest and disappeared from everyone's sight. Not far into this road, the green bamboos gradually became sparse, and one could see the clear green jade-like river on the side of the road. The river flowed slowly, and if one did not look carefully, one would think that it was a lake. It was the Lujing River that passed through the city, circled around the city, and finally reached the Tsang Mountains in the west. Somewhere upstream, this river gathered rouge, gathered colorful lanterns on the pleasure boats, and gathered half of Jingdo's erotic prosperity. Even though Fan Xian's Baoyue brothel had suddenly risen, it still did not completely steal away the flavor of this river. By the time the Lujing River reached the outskirts of Jingdo and came to this bamboo forest and green trees, it was already much quieter and quieter, particularly the courtyard on the small peninsula across the river. In this bright and beautiful spring, it suffused with a fresh and elegant flavor and added a sense of being aloof from the world and independent. Taiping Courtyard, the courtyard of the mistress of the Yi family. Later, it became the courtyard of the royal family. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the eldest princess had once lived there for 2 days. She had only stayed there for 2 days before the courtyard returned to its silence. It was as if no one had ever lived there. Fan Xian got off the carriage and looked calmly at the courtyard. He thought of the people who had once lived in the courtyard and became absent-minded for a moment. After the Jingdo Rebellion had been quelled, the emperor had hinted twice that he was going to bestow this courtyard to Fan Xian again. Fan Xian knew that it was best not for him to bring up this matter, so he had always treated it calmly. For some reason, this matter never came to fruition in the end. In the summer of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, after staying a night in the Fan clan's country estate outside the city, Fan Xian had brought his sister here and kowtowed twice to Taiping Courtyard to express his sorrow. He did not go in because he knew that the emperor had a different kind of feeling toward this courtyard and a different kind of fear. Later, Fan Xian still went in. He and Uncle Wu Zhu found the bullets for the heavy sniper rifle in a secret room in Taiping courtyard. They also wandered inside for a long time. The two of them did not care about the royal guards at all. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. His gaze shone through the faint moisture on the river. It was as if he was going to pierce through the greenish-gray walls of Taiping courtyard and see everything inside. There was no grave inside. This was a fact that Fan Xian had long confirmed. His father, Fan Jian, had once told him in private that Yi Qingmei's grave was in a secluded place. Later, he had pointed out that it was in Taiping courtyard, but it was not there. Later, Fan Xian thought it was in the royal palace, but it was not there either. There was only a painting of a yellow-clothed woman. Yi Qingmei was no longer in this world. It was not important where she was buried. However, Fan Xian would occasionally think of a question. Was the emperor also afraid to face the wisp of soul underground? Fan Xian sat down by the river and lifted the front of his long robe to his knees. Very neatly, he said seriously, I am thinking about some things here. Don't let anyone disturb me. Yes, sir. Mu Feng, and a few of the Qinian unit close to him lowered their heads and accepted the order at the same time. Leading the guards around them, they dispersed into the depths of the bamboo forest until Fan Xian could not see them and they could not see the riverside. Don't let anyone disturb him, including these subordinates. Mu Feng, and the others understood Fan Xian's thoughts. However, they did not understand his current mood. They retreated to a place far away and warily watched the movements on the roads around them. Sealing off the sound of the wind, they silently guessed in their hearts. The courtyard across the river was once the mistress of the Yi family's residence. This was something all the old Jingdo people knew. The mistress of the Yi family was Sir Fan Jr.'s birth mother. This was something the entire world already knew. Sir Fan Jr. had chosen to meditate here. Naturally, the things he was thinking about were thorny and important. After sitting for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally felt that he was tired from sitting. The secluded forest, green bamboo, gray courtyard, still water, moss, stone, and floating leaves had all become a joke. The stone under his butt suddenly seemed particularly sharp and painful. He stood and patted the dust behind him. Furrowing his brows, he shook his head but did not leave immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps toward the riverside. Lowering his body, he scooped up a handful of slightly cold river water and splashed it on his face. It was as if he wanted to make the burning heat on his face colder. At this moment, a handkerchief was extended from the side. It was as if she wanted him to wipe away the water droplets on his face. Fan Xian was not surprised at all. Accepting the handkerchief, he randomly wiped at his face. He then reached into the river and wrung it a few times until it was slightly wet and cold. Only then did he return it with a smile and say, "You're most afraid of heat. Chill your face a bit." Fan Ruoruo, dressed in plain white clothing, smiled and accepted the wet handkerchief from her brother's hand. Carefully, she wiped at her ears and cheeks. It looked like she had come in a hurry. The usual frost on her face was now completely wiped away by the flush on her cheeks. "Why have you come?" Fan Xian turned and walked toward the riverbank. Very naturally, he stretched out his hand, wanting to hold his sister's hand to prevent her from falling. Unexpectedly, Fan Ruoruo did not see her brother's outstretched hand and had already walked forward. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Looks like he didn't hide anything back then. You've only been studying for a short time, but your body is much better than before." Fan Ruoruo smiled and didn't respond to this question. She replied to Fan Xian's earlier words, "Brother, you just came back last night. Why did you run out again today? Someone in Jingdo is looking for you on urgent business. Sister-in-law just had to enter the palace." The Ting family was annoyed by that person and had no choice but to find the medical shop. I went to the first bureau to ask around and found out that you had left the city. I was just about to go to Chen Garden when I saw Mu Feng at the intersection. I knew you must be here, so I got out of the car to find you. The people in the council shouldn't know that Fan Xian had come to Chen Garden. However, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to such small matters. He asked, "What is it that you're looking for me so urgently?" As the brother and sister spoke, they sat down. Just like 5 years ago, they faced the far end of the river. "It's nothing urgent. It's just that I haven't seen you in a long time." "I miss you," Fan Ruoruo said with a slight smile. Fan Ruoruo said with a slight smile. Actually, if that person was bothering Miss Fan, it must be an extremely important matter. However, this intelligent girl had discovered that her brother had come to Taiping Courtyard to meditate. She must have even more trouble in her heart. She didn't want to bother him with matters of officialdom. Fan Xian thought that it was indeed impossible for anything important to happen in the officialdom of the Qing kingdom. He couldn't help smiling and shaking his head. "Since it's not something important, it's good for you to sit with me. I was just finding it a bit stuffy sitting alone." They sat for another hour. Fan Xian had some thoughts in his heart, so he didn't want to speak. He only felt that having a sister who completely trusted him sitting by his side could indeed help his emotions stabilize a bit. Fan Ruoruo didn't have any other thoughts. She only faintly thought that as long as she could sit quietly by her brother's side, it would be fine. After a long time, the sun had long passed through the top of the bamboo forest and slowly moved toward the west. The faint light became countless mottled shadows and hit the brother and sister's faces. Fan Xian's eyes happened to be blinded by the patches of light. He couldn't help but rub his eyes and sigh. Fan Ruoruo's heart jumped. She heard too much distress, hatred, helplessness, and heaviness in this sigh. She lowered her head slightly and thought for a long time. She then said, "Perhaps it's better to say what's on your mind." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, "My birth mother was Yi Qingmei." Fan Ruoruo was slightly startled and raised her eyes to look at him. She thought to herself that in the entire world, she was probably one of the first to know this secret. Why was her brother repeating it now? She knew that Fan Xian would certainly have something else to say, so she only made a quiet hum and didn't express her confusion. "Back then, I brought you here to worship the distant river. I worshipped her for bestowing this physical body on me so that I could live in this world," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said calmly, "I have come to see from afar today because I respect her actions in the past. I respect her for leaving me, her son, so many benefits. She has also given the people of this world different possibilities and more choices." Fan Ruoruo listened quietly to the side. "In my life, I've never seen her appearance or heard her voice, but I've seen too many of the marks she left behind." Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then continued, "I've also seen a great deal on this trip to Dongyi. Thus, the image of her in my heart is becoming clearer and clearer. I'm also becoming more and more used to seeing her as my mother." He added in his heart, even though she didn't seem to be much older than him. "If someone harmed her back then, what do you think I, as a son, should do?" Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. His brows were filled with gloom. Fan Ruoruo suddenly felt nervous. Tightly gripping the wet handkerchief in her hand, she said in a trembling voice, "Didn't those people all die? The Empress Dowager has also passed on a long time ago. Naturally, the Empress Dowager had to die." Fan Xian didn't tell his sister that the Empress Dowager had actually died at his hands. He smiled slightly mockingly and said, "But, there are still some people who should have died who didn't." Fan Ruoruo didn't open her mouth to ask. She had a strong feeling that she would certainly hear a name that would make her heart jump. "I guessed a long time ago that the emperor was my father," Fan Xian said. However, in the first 2 years, I didn't see him as my father at all. Not only him, but it was also very difficult for me to see Yi Qingmei as my mother. This has nothing to do with what happened back then. It's not that I felt a sense of defeat from being abandoned. This is something that cannot be explained clearly. When he came into this world, he had already taken his soul with him. However, the relationships between people are always forged by time. This has nothing to do with blood or closeness, Fan Xian said tiredly with his head lowered. Just like how I have seen you as my sister since I was young and will always see you as the closest person in this life, time can always change many things. Time can always change many things. After being with His Majesty for so long, I could feel that he treated me differently than his other sons. Particularly these few years, the Emperor has changed too much. He suddenly smiled. His smile was slightly cute. Tell me, if the Emperor had killed my mother back then, what would I have done? Fan Ruoruo's heart jumped. Her hands unconsciously tightened and squeezed out the last few drops of water from the handkerchief. The brother who voted for 600 new tickets in the year of Qingyu, I'm crying. I watched with my own eyes as so much money floated away from my eyes. It is so painful that I wish I were dead. A lazy person like me with nothing to do really can't do it. I can only drool, especially these few days. However, I still have to sincerely say thank you. Chapter 654. The sky above Jingdo was alternating between cloudy and sunny. It was impossible to accurately reveal a smile or a worried expression, such as Fan Ruoruo's face. This girl's face alternated between green and white. Her slightly sweaty and slightly red cheeks had been scared into a theater after hearing these words. She fully displayed the emotions a Qing Kingdom citizen should be displaying at this time. It was clearly a warm spring day, but Fan Ruoruo's body seemed to be tortured in an icehouse. A moment later, she said in a low, trembling voice, I don't know. This was the most useless answer, but it was also the most natural answer. Fan Xian had already fallen into a black hole and was unable to free himself. If he held his sister's hand, at most, he would have another pitiful junior torn to pieces. It would not be of much help to the matter. Fan Xian's heart softened. He gently stroked the girl's head and warmly said, Don't be scared, silly. It's just that there's no place to reason with, so I can only talk to you. After a long time, Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother with a timid gaze and said in a mosquito-like voice, Is it true? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. His gaze turned to the quiet and secluded little courtyard across the river. He thought of the bloody knife disaster this little courtyard had suffered 20 years ago. He thought that perhaps 20 years ago, this place had been hell on earth. Who knew how many people of the old Yi family had died, and that stunningly talented girl had coincidentally been at the weakest stage of her life. She had given birth to him. Furthermore, all the people around her that she could rely on had, for one reason or another, all left her side for important reasons that could not be turned back. She was alone and without help. This was a sudden attack from the place closest to her, a fierce and decisive killing intent. Presumably, when she left this world, she must have been unsatisfied and lonely, right? Borrowed seed? Fan Xian would not believe this. He understood women too well. Even if this woman was his mother, the one and only Yi Qingmei in the world, Fan Xian still did not believe it. If she had no feelings for a man, how could she charm him into her bed? Other women might feign civility with a man they didn't like because of social or family reasons, but did Yi Qingmei need to? Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the river. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. That man was truly cold-blooded. A trembling voice pulled Fan Xian back from the tragic scene of the past. Fan Ruoruo clung tightly to her brother's side as if she was afraid of the cold. The wet handkerchief in her hand had long fallen to the grass. Her hand gripped Fan Xian's sleeve tightly. Raising her face, she said, I used to have a brother. A chill suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He knew what his sister was talking about. He had known since he was a child that there should have been a young master in Count Sinan's manor. That young master should be about the same age as him. He was the son of his father and first wife. However, because of his weak body, he died at a young age. At this moment, his sister suddenly mentioned the elder brother who had long since disappeared from people's memories. Fan Xian vaguely seemed to catch on to something, and his expression immediately changed. Chen Pingping had reminded Fan Xian more than once to treat Fan Jian better, because the Fan family had sacrificed a lot for his survival. What did the Fan family pay? Could it be that the reason he was able to survive in Taiping courtyard and endure until Uncle Wu Zhu hurried back was because under the fierce attacks of the Empress Dowager, the Qin family, and the Empress's clan, someone had accepted death in his place? Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He thought silently to himself, if this was how things had progressed, first it was hidden from the Empress Dowager. Later, when Count Sinan raised an illegitimate child in Danzhou, why did the palace not become suspicious? Had the emperor suppressed the situation after returning to the capital and sealed off the news? His head hurt slightly. There were some details he had not thought through clearly, but the possible terrifying scene became clear in his mind. He indifferently thought that when he opened his eyes for the first time in this world, he saw his pair of baby-white lotus-like hands. In front of the hands that were stained with blood, there was already a newborn baby who had died in his place. His baby-like hands were not only smeared with the blood of the people Uncle Wu Zhu had killed, but also the blood of the true young master of the Fan family. Fan Xian's body trembled slightly. Ruoruo clearly sensed her brother's abnormality. Sorrowfully, she said in a low voice, I don't know how he died. Later, I faintly heard the old nanny in the manor mention it while crying. I have some suspicions, but I don't know what went wrong. Fan Xian gently held his sister's hand and didn't say a word. He knew that not long after giving birth to Ruoruo, Ruoruo's birth mother was bedridden and died. It was only later that his father welcomed Lady Lu into the manor. What was it about the wife of an assistant minister that had been troubled all this time? Was it because her own son had died when he shouldn't have? Ruoruo then lowered her head and quietly said, I heard the old nanny say that mother and auntie should also know each other. Fan Xian had gradually come to understand the deeper meaning of Chen Pingping's words. But he still didn't understand. If Chen Pingping knew that his father had paid such a great price for him, why did he still refuse to lower his guard against his father all those years ago? The relationship between Count Sinan and Yi Qingmei was not like the first love that Fan Xian had imagined when he was young. Perhaps the two of them trusted each other more like siblings, just like Fan Xian and Ruoruo today. Yi Qingmei had just given birth to a son in Taiping courtyard. It was normal for Count Sinan's wife to go to the courtyard to help. As for what happened afterward, perhaps it was just as Fan Xian guessed. Was it like the plot of a novel? It turned out that reality was always more bizarre than fiction. More accurately, reality should always be more bizarre than fiction. Fan Xian tightly held his sister's hand. His heart was filled with countless complicated feelings. Before his eyes floated the face of his grandmother, who had always loved him dearly, and the solemn face of his father. It seemed that he would never be angry, never be happy, and that he would only silently walk the bureaucracy. His heart suddenly ached. He felt that he owed the Fan family too much. His heart suddenly grew cold. Back then, too many people had died and too much blood had been shed. Fan Xian stood up and looked coldly at Taiping courtyard across the river. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, Don't tell anyone about what we talked about today. Although he knew that his sister would certainly not spread this shocking secret, Fan Xian still couldn't help but remind her. He then said in a low voice, Concerning this matter, I have to ask my father in person. Brother is returning to Danzhou? Ruoruo followed suit and stood up, looking at him in surprise. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Father is not in Danzhou right now." The retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was living out his retirement in Danzhou. This was something everyone knew. But Fan Xian said with unusual certainty that his father was not in Danzhou because only he knew that his father was in a place in the northeast, helping him do something important. He had to ask his father in person because he believed that on this matter, his father also had the right to speak. Fan Ruoruo resisted the urge to ask. She only stared in a daze at her brother's gloomy face. Her heart ached slightly. She knew that the things Fan Xian said today would stir up a great storm in the future. Fan Xian was not only the second most powerful person in the world, he also had too much power in his hands. If he truly had a falling out with the emperor and wanted to avenge his mother, a great battle between ruler and official would probably drag the entire world into it. "Come with me to another place." Fan Xian walked toward the path deep in the bamboo forest. Ruoruo made a sound of acknowledgement and followed with small steps. 3 black carriages left the bamboo forest near Taiping Courtyard and came to another eerie place on the outskirts of the capital. The coldness of this place was different from Taiping Courtyard. It gave off a sense of fear because this was a cemetery. Many people had been buried in Taiping Courtyard. Many people had also been buried here. Fan Xian had left his old home and come to a place of death. The Overwatch Council officials following behind him all felt a chill. They didn't know what exactly had happened. The feng shui at the foot of the Green Mountain on this side was very good. Buried were the graves of the nameless soldiers left behind by the Qing Kingdom's wars from south to north. Among them, the newest and largest cemetery had been built 3 years ago. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the imperial soldiers had suffered heavy casualties. The Overwatch Council had also paid a terrifying price, particularly the attack on Qin Heng's vanguard camp at Zhengyang Gate and the Black Knight's later valiant pursuit in front of the square, which added 1,000 more graves to the new cemetery. The traditional April festival had just passed, so there were still many traces of worship left in the cemetery. Incense and unburned paper money floated quietly in the mountain wind among the graves. Fan Xian brought his subordinates and sister to the graves and bowed deeply toward the cemetery. The people buried here were all his subordinates. They were all people who had died because of his one decision and one plan. Only now did Mu Feng, and the other subordinates know what the commissioner wanted to do. They felt deeply moved and moved. He was about to take over as director of the Overwatch Council. Unexpectedly, after returning to the council to deal with matters, the first thing he did was come to the cemetery to pay respects to his dead brothers. Seeing the commissioner sincerely and attentively bow, the eyes of the dozens of Overwatch Council officials in Qingshan Garden couldn't help but moisten. They followed behind him and bowed. However, they had come in a hurry and had no time to set up anything. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "What matters is sincerity. I don't care about other things." To the side, Mu Feng, agreed. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, after returning to the capital, "Have Mu Tai check on the pensions these years and how the families of the officials in the council have been taken care of. Draft a file for me." "Yes, sir." Mu Feng made a sound of acknowledgement and was not afraid. The follow-up matters of the Overwatch Council's pensions were all handled by the First Bureau. His uncle Mu Tai was the head of the First Bureau. Hearing that Sir Fan Jr. was going to check the accounts, he was not worried at all. In the entire court, only the Overwatch Council's pensions were the highest. The commissioner looked after the families of his subordinates very well. Of course, it was also because Fan Xian had the palace treasury, a gold mine, hidden in his sleeves. Secondly, he knew that his uncle would never dare to make a mistake in these matters. Fan Xian paid no more attention to him. With his hands behind his back, he led Ruoruo out of the cemetery at the foot of Qingshan Garden, leaving a distance behind his loyal subordinates. It was not until they were about to climb to the waist of Qingshan Garden did he turn his head to look at the densely packed graves below him. He sighed and said, "A general success is built on the bones of tens of thousands." Ruoruo didn't understand why her brother had come here after thinking quietly for a long time in Taiping courtyard. Fan Xian seemed to guess what she was thinking. In a low voice, he explained, "I want to use these dead people to remind myself that I am no longer just me. I have to be responsible for many people who are alive and those who are dead. I have to use these graves to remind me and make me more clear-headed and calm." The brother and sister climbed past the waste of Qingshan Garden and turned to the other side. It was said that the feng shui on this side was not as good as the other side, but it was still densely packed with graves. They were all places where the ancestors of the Jingdo people were buried. At this moment, the smell of smoke and fire seemed to float in the air. There were a few large graves on the col separating the two sides of Qingshan Garden. The style of the graves was normal, but they appeared very large. Furthermore, there was a garden outside the graves and soldiers guarding them. A few soldiers saw someone slowly walk in and were about to go forward and yell at him when they were immediately chased out by a few Overwatch Council swordsmen. Buried in these graves were the eldest princess, the crown prince, and the second prince. Fan Xian walked past the eldest princess' grave and the crown prince's grave. His expression did not change at all. In the end, to Ruoruo's surprise, he stopped in front of the second prince's grave. The Empress Dowager's grave was far to the south of Tsang Mountain. It was 80 li from Jingdo. It was said that it took up a lot of space and was beautifully decorated. It perfectly displayed the emperor's benevolence and filial piety. However, Fan Xian had never been there even once. The Overwatch Council officials scattered in all directions. Fan Xian and his sister stood quietly in front of the second prince's grave. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Actually, I don't like you very much because I know you and I are the same kind of person. Just as you said the night before you died, we don't like each other. From the first time I saw you, I saw through the bashful smile on your face and knew your hypocrisy." Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the grave. "Of course, when you saw the bashful smile on my face, you also knew my hypocrisy. However, you can't prove this. You are only subconsciously guessing. Because I hide deeper than you, my smile is more real than yours." Fan Xian's voice was not loud, but it appeared particularly determined. "When it comes to acting, no one in this world can compare to me. From the day I was born, I was acting." A bashful smile? If you want to pretend to be a baby, of course, you have to learn how babies smile. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. "This has already become my natural nature. I only know how to smile shyly, it's so embarrassing." He raised his head and said, "Chengzi, in the future, when I don't have to smile shyly anymore, I will come see you again." Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother in astonishment. She didn't know why he was talking nonsense in front of the second prince's grave. What did he mean by pretending to be a baby? Fan Xian stretched in front of the grave. He had long stood up, but the bashful smile on his face had become an impatient and angry expression towards the world. Fan Ruoruo finally couldn't resist reaching out her hand to touch his forehead to see if her brother had a fever from the shock of the news. In the end, the place she touched was icy cold. Fan Xian was startled by her, but he immediately understood what she was thinking and laughed loudly. Hearing Fan Xian let out a rare hearty laugh, Fan Ruoruo relaxed and also laughed. However, there was still a layer of haze in her heart. Looking at her brother, she didn't know what kind of hardship and struggle there was in this laughter. Fan Xian calmed down and warmly said, "The things I wanted to do today, the crazy things I wanted to do, have all been done. Earlier, you said something happened in the capital. What exactly is it?" Fan Ruoruo hesitated for a moment and then quietly said, "The young lady of the Sun family has come to the manor. Fortunately, sister-in-law is not here. She has made Master Ting very anxious." Sun Jingxiu's daughter? Fan Xian paused for a moment. How did a young lady of a noble family make such a fuss? This young lady of the Sun family was the Fan who had helped Fan Xian greatly during the Jingdo rebellion. However, Fan Xian knew this girl's personality. No matter how much she loved the story of the stone, she would not do something so damaging to her family's reputation. She came for her father? Fan Ruoruo glanced at him probingly. Something seems to have happened on Sir Sun's side. He was so anxious that he couldn't do anything. I think Miss Sun was also forced to come by her father. A gust of wind came from the mountains and made Fan Xian's clothes flap loudly. It made his brows furrow. He couldn't resist cursing. However, his voice was very low. Even Fan Ruoruo, who was standing beside him, didn't hear clearly. Concerning Fan Xian's slightly bashful smile, ever since I started writing about the year of Qingyu last year, there have been many people who disliked it. Furthermore, in many places, they expressed confusion about how I wrote it. I have never explained it because this way of writing has no beauty and no box office. However, I wanted to persist. In the beginning, I persisted in writing it this way because of a very simple reason. Before I wrote about the year of Qingyu, I was wondering what kind of strange existence an adult's soul would become in a baby's body. However, I wasn't writing about strange things, so I could only use some minor details to remind everyone that the slightly bashful smile was an important part. If a 20-year-old wanted to pretend to be an innocent and ignorant baby, how should he smile? How should he giggle? I have observed many children and found that there is one type of smile that is most common, and that is the slightly bashful smile. Fan Xian pretended to be slightly bashful for a long time, so when he grew up in the world of the Qing kingdom, he inevitably developed this kind of habit. This was something that I thought was necessary to make up his expression. It was a very powerful detail, but unfortunately, it was interpreted in a different direction. I really wanted to shout, "How serious am I? I am a pearl, dust, go away." I shrugged. However, everyone knows that I was criticized badly, so I didn't persist with the bashful smile. There was no way around it, I wanted to eat. I was dissatisfied with myself for not being able to stick to my structure and description, but to be able to find an opportunity to explain it to everyone was something that I was very happy about. These 2 chapters confirmed Fan Xian's heart. In the future, he would not write about this content. He would only do it. There are tombs in the Vermilion Bird story, and there are also tombs in the year of Qingyu, because these are all very important things. Recently, I haven't written much, so I haven't written much. This chapter was written in advance and posted at a fixed time, because I had things to do during the day. I don't ask for everyone's understanding, because you guys are too bad, too bad. Of the 3,000 update votes, 300 were voted. Of the 6,000 update votes, more than 700 were voted. Of the 12,000 update votes, 1,500 were voted. I counted with my fingers. I earned an extra 150 a day. Nearly 400? More than 700 yuan. Then I was furious. My classmates were clearly bullying me for only writing 5,000 words today. Of course, I could still write a few dozen more words at this time, but I won't succumb to your sugar-coated bullets. Actually, it's just that if I take the money for 6,000 words, I won't feel at ease. Today, I wrote 900 words just for the epilogue alone. Speaking of which, seeing everyone having fun, I was also very happy. I had been too emotional recently. Thank you all for having fun with me, and thank you all for supporting me with so many update votes. Chapter 655. Fan Xian had already expressed all the emotions he needed to express. What he should have felt, 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 and what he should have been determined had all become fresh cement in his mind. Additionally, his sister had also spoken of the true reason she had come to find him. Naturally, he would not stay around these large graves. A group of people quickly boarded the carriage and headed into Jingdo. In the carriage, he listened attentively to his sister's account of what had happened in the manor. His furrowed brows gradually relaxed because the matter was much simpler than he had imagined. It wasn't a big matter. The matter involved the Jingdo magistrate. It should have been a big matter. However, these struggles and conflicts in officialdom were not much in Fan Xian's eyes. They were just slightly troublesome problems. She came this morning. She only said she was here to visit the princess. According to Master Tang, looking at her gaze, she probably still wants to find you, Fan Ruoruo said in a low voice. Sister-in-law has entered the palace. There is no one in charge in the manor. Additionally, she knows her identity is sensitive, so she came to find me. What is there to be sensitive about? Fan Xian raised his brows sensitively and said unnaturally. If I remember correctly, Sun Pin, is not much older than Wuxia. It is not too out of line for her to come to the manor to chat with you. I didn't mean it that way. Fan Ruoruo saw the uneasiness on her brother's face in a glance and smiled. However, Sun Jingxiu is holding a birthday banquet in 2 days. If he wants to invite you, he should personally send an invitation. No matter what, it would not be his unmarried daughter's turn to appear. Why would he send an invitation to me? Fan Xian smiled. He's afraid of me more than enough. I've ruined his reputation for a lifetime. Besides, he is just a third-level official. Even if he wants to do something big, he wouldn't bother me. He must have something to ask of you. Fan Ruoruo lowered her head and thought for a bit. I just don't know what troublesome matter it is. Fan Xian paused slightly. These few months, all of his attention had been placed in the direction of Dongyi. He had paid less attention to Jingdo. He didn't know what strange movements there were. However, the 4 seas were at peace, and the Qing kingdom's politics were unusually stable. Why would someone jump out and make trouble? After thinking for a bit, he lifted the curtain and gave Mu Feng a meaningful glance. Mu Feng understood and rode closer to the carriage. He lowered his head to listen to Fan Xian's quiet instructions and nodded repeatedly. The group of carriages entered the capital, circled around the side alley of the main street in the south of the city, and quietly stopped at the corner gate. Fan Xian got out of the car with his sister and looked around. Like a thief, he snuck in. After entering the garden, he was not in a hurry to go to the side hall to see the young lady of the Sun family. Instead, he made a shushing gesture and hid in the number 3 quiet study. Fan Ruoruo looked at him in astonishment. She thought that along the way in the carriage, it was clear that her brother was very concerned about the Jingdo government's matters. Sun Pin was clearly in the side hall. He could have just gone and asked directly. Why was he hiding here? Fan Xian looked at his sister's expression and smiled self-mockingly. After all, she is an unmarried girl. It is truly inconvenient for me to openly see her. Fan Ruoruo spat out a laugh and said, "You're afraid of that? If you really knew there were differences between men and women, you wouldn't have hidden in the young lady's boudoir for a few days 3 years ago." After these words were said, her face couldn't help but redden. Blinking, she glanced at her brother and giggled. Not only me, but even Cece was later very curious. How exactly did you sleep in the young lady's boudoir those nights? Fan Xian did not laugh or get angry. He only sighed helplessly and said, "It is already my fault for a girl as clean as ice and as clean as jade to be troubled by these rumors. Each time I think of it, I feel guilty. Yet, you still use this to make fun of me. It is truly not kind." Fan Ruoruo respected her brother the most. Hearing these words, she quickly became silent. However, the curiosity in her heart could not be erased. During the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, Fan Xian hid in the boudoir of the Jingdo government. He secretly used the Jingdo government's procedures to arrange for the Black Knights to enter the capital and make preparations for his future comeback. At the same time, he subdued the Jingdo government. This was the most talked about legend in Jingdo these years. Many people were guessing at the relationship between Sir Fan Jr. and the young lady of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu's family. Why was that young lady willing to take such a big risk and betray her father to help Fan Xian? Why did Sir Fan Jr. strongly protect Sun Jingxiu afterward, only remember his merit and not his grudge, help him secure his position as the Jingdo magistrate, and not be implicated in the rebellion? Even Fan Xian didn't know how the story of those few nights had spread to everyone. He was worried that it would affect Sun Pin's reputation and bring this girl too much trouble. When the rumors were at their worst, he was slightly angry and had the Overwatch Council investigate. Who knew that in the end, they would find a serving girl in the Jingdo government? Since the rumors had accidentally leaked in her garden, Fan Xian had no way of dealing with it. He could only pay special attention to his relationship with the Jingdo government. During these 3 years, there had been no communication at all. Even the Jingdo magistrate, Sir Sun Jingxiu, probably knew what Fan Xian was thinking and was deeply moved. Other than official business, he didn't even send a name card to the Fan manor. After staying in the study for a while, Mu Feng led his uncle, Mu Tai, in. When Fan Ruoruo heard the knock on the door, she had already hidden into the back room. Fan Xian looked at the sweaty face of the head of the first bureau, Mu Tai. Looking at his dark face, he couldn't resist saying, "Although I am in Dongyi, if there is any major movement in the capital, you have to quickly let me know." Mu Tai had already learned from his nephew that Fan Xian wanted to ask about the Jingdo magistrate's matter. He had already made preparations, but he heard the faint displeasure in Fan Xian's tone. His throat couldn't help but become dry. He didn't argue anything and directly placed the already organized files on Fan Xian's table. Fan Xian picked up the files and looked through them one by one. His brows gradually furrowed. A moment later, he sighed. During the few months he had devoted himself to Dongyi, there had indeed been some movement in the capital. Not only Sun Jingxiu, but the lives of a few other officials had also been wretched. The Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments began to secretly investigate these officials. As for the specific matters to be investigated, there were all sorts of things. Having been in the Overwatch Council for a long time, Fan Xian knew that no yamen could be completely pure. As long as they investigated hard, no matter what the reason was, they would always find some problems. The Jingdo government was being investigated in secret by a few departments. It was beginning to bear an unbearable pressure. As the saying went, a storm was brewing. It would probably not be able to hold out much longer. The officialdom was the most sensitive. The civil and martial officials had caught wind of it. Even if they didn't add insult to injury, they began to look at it coldly. No wonder Sun Jingxiu had suddenly thought of holding a birthday banquet. He probably still hadn't figured out the palace's intentions. Was it a routine investigation or was they preparing to use this matter to have him resign? Holding a birthday banquet could clearly see the palace's attitude. Fan Xian shook his head. He thought to himself that this magistrate did things seriously and righteously. Even if he had stood on the wrong side during the Jingdo rebellion, it had only been a technical error. It was this kind of personality that made the emperor tolerate him for another 3 years. It was also this kind of personality that made him unable to see just what the palace wanted to do. He still had the delusion that he could continue sitting in the important position of the Jingdo magistrate. Fan Xian saw at a glance the deep reason for the storm in the officialdom. The officials, including Sun Jingxiu, were all not very clean. Although Sun Jingxiu had performed a great service in the end, at the beginning, he had stood against the emperor's final edict. Those officials had not stood too firmly during the Jingdo rebellion and were suspected of being opportunists. The emperor was settling accounts after autumn. 3 years was not too late. Given the emperor's sinister personality, how could he let go of these despicable officials who had wavered in the past? Mu Tai saw that he was lost in thought. He swallowed and moistened his throat. Carefully, he reminded him the limelight began with the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments investigation. It was definitely something that the Hall of Governmental Affairs agreed to do. This was a reminder to the commissioner that changing the Jingdo magistrate might have come from the palace. It was a reminder to Fan Xian not to clash with the emperor's intentions for the sake of a young lady of the Sun family. Fan Xian smiled. He had no interest in falling out with the emperor at a time like this. Furthermore, it was not worth it to fall out just for the position of Jingdo magistrate. Even if the emperor wanted to force Sun Jingxiu off the stage, he would not go so far as to kill him. Since it was so, he would let the emperor vent his resentment that had not been completely vented. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He remembered that the emperor had once promised him to keep Sun Jingxiu safe. He shouldn't go back on his word so quickly. Even if he wanted to go back on his word, he would have to look at his face. It was impossible for him to have the Hall of Governmental Affairs appear. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Has Hu the scholar said anything about this matter?" Presently, Hu the scholar was the leader of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If the emperor truly wanted to use the Hall of Governmental Affairs to make this arrangement, then the Hall of Governmental Affairs' inclination should have come from Hu the scholar's lips. No. Mu Tai glanced at him and said, however, that He Zongwei once said something after drinking, and the pressure on the Jingdo government increased. Everyone in the Overwatch Council, including the people in the Fan Manor, knew that Fan Xian greatly disliked He Zongwei of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Thus, no one dared to show any admiration, respect, or any other positive emotional evaluation of He Zongwei in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed coldly and said, after saying something after drinking, he made the Jingdo magistrate lose his appetite. "This sir, he is quite impressive." Although he said this, he understood that given the emperor's recent trust in He Zongwei was only using his mouth to announce the emperor's intentions. If Sun Jingxiu knew what was good for him, he would have long asked to resign. However, it was clear that this Jingdo magistrate was not a clever person and did not realize this. Fan Xian thought deeply for a long time and then said, "I know about this matter." Mu Tai glanced at him and did not tidy up the files on the table. He only said, "Even if you want to go to the Sun Manor, you only need to remind him. There is no need to do anything else." I know. You talk too much." Fan Xian waved his hand angrily and had the uncle and nephew leave. Before Fan Ruoruo came, another servant came to report that Yang Wanli had arrived. Fan Xian's spirits rose. He thought of how this bastard was doing very well in the Ministry of Works Yamen and had devoted his heart to political affairs. It had been a long time since he had come to pay his respects. How could he be free today? Fan Xian was very happy and quickly had someone invite him to the back of the manor. Unexpectedly, when Yang Wanli entered the study, his dark face was full of grievance. Yang Wanli was already the vice-director of the river department of the Ministry of Works and a proper official in charge. Given this speed, it was certain that he would become a minister within 10 years. However, it was not entirely because Fan Xian was supporting him from behind. This official had experienced the tempering of the harsh sun on the Jiangnan dikes. He was no longer the pedantic scholar of the past who only knew how to talk about saving the country. Instead, he was a proper and capable official, which was why he had risen so quickly in the Ministry of Works. Thus, Fan Xian was surprised to see his expression today. The two of them said something in low voices. Fan Xian's expression became uglier and uglier. In the end, he only said a few comforting words in a low voice and had him leave. Yang Wanli rarely came to the manor to visit. Fan Xian secretly knew that he did indeed spend every day in the yamen, so he did not find it strange. On the contrary, he purposely helped him save time. After Yang Wanli left, Fan Ruoruo walked out from the back room. Furrowing her brows slightly, she said, "What is it now?" Fan Xian's expression was heavy. He thought for a moment and then replied, "It's around the same time as Sun Jingxiu's matter. He Zongwei is becoming more and more arrogant." Whoever I want to protect, he extends his hand to. Fan Ruoruo listened quietly. Only now did she know that Yang Wanli's life in the Ministry of Works Yamen had not been very smooth recently. The Ministry of Revenue was also checking accounts in the Ministry of Works Yamen. The focus was on the Metropolitan Water Bureau he was in charge of. There was even the shadow of the Supreme Court and Ministry of Appointments behind it. Every year, Yang Wanli had Fan Xian's silver to support him and lived well. He was also not a corrupt official. With internal and external factors added together, the accounts that passed through his hands were clear. No matter how the Ministry of Revenue investigated, they could not find any problems. Even when the Ministry of Appointments privately asked him to question him and raised doubts about his manner and the number of female servants, they were blocked by Yang Wanli with the excuse that it was a gift from his teacher. The officials of the Ministry of Appointments did not have the courage to go to the Fan Manor and ask Fan Xian for confirmation. However, on Yang Wanli's side, in the end, some small details were caught. The reason was actually related to Fan Xian. This matter had to start a few years ago. In the 2 years after the river burst its banks, Fan Xian was in charge of the palace treasury. Using his own methods, his father's help, as well as Xia Mingji and Fan Xija's routes in the north, he had scooped up a great deal of silver from the palace treasury. After a few twists and turns, he had sent it to the river transport governor's yamen at the time. At that time, Yang Wanli was still working in the river transport governor's yamen. This large sum of silver, which made countless people tremble in fear, was in his hands. There were always some carelessness in the operation of the silver, and people had something to use against him. In particular, the officials of the Ministry of Appointments faintly raised questions about where the silver had come from. If this problem were to be investigated further, it was likely that many people would die. But, where did the question come from? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. He laughed coldly and scolded, "The silver was dug out from my savings. The emperor knows this, yet he still came to investigate. He is truly generous and virtuous." He glanced at his sister and sighed. Even the Ministry of Revenue is interfering. It looks like it will be difficult for the Fan family to control the Ministry of Revenue. In a society with imperial power, Fan Xian, as an official, was shamelessly boasting about controlling the Ministry of Revenue. It was truly a rebellious complaint. However, what he said was not wrong. Back then, regardless of whether his father was an assistant minister or a minister of the Ministry of Revenue, the entire Ministry of Revenue had been organized into a solid block. Regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince or the Second Prince, they had no way of extending their hands in. Even that spring day, when the emperor wanted to use the Ministry of Revenue matter to stir up some trouble, he had been blocked by Fan Jian. Back then, the Ministry of Revenue was the legendary independent kingdom, right? If it was at that time, who in the Ministry of Revenue would dare to investigate the Jingdo government and Yang Wanli, a student of Fan Xian's school? Even if they couldn't stop the higher-ups from investigating, they would probably have secretly informed Fan Xian. However, following Fan Jian's sad retirement, the emperor slowly inserted officials into the Ministry of Revenue and transferred officials. The present Ministry of Revenue was no longer the Ministry of Revenue of the past. Each time Fan Xian thought of this, he felt angry on behalf of his father, although this anger was unreasonable. After Fan Xian brought up the name He Zongwei, Fan Ruoruo fell silent. Her face was slightly awkward and self-blaming. Fan Xian glanced at his sister and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Don't think too much. He Zongwei alone would not dare to act against my people. This must be the palace's intention." "Of course." Fan Xian lowered his head and continued. "Looks like this popular sir he has also given up on the idea of a marriage alliance with our family and currying favor with me. He has decided to follow the emperor's wishes and be a loyal dog." He huffed coldly and said, "He Zongwei knows that the emperor has raised him up to fight against me and that he will only die a horrible death, but he has no choice. Since it is so, he hopes to be able to truly find the big problem between me and the emperor. He incessantly stimulated me, hoping that I would truly capsize. Only then would he be able to preserve his life. Why does the emperor want to do this? This was the greatest unease and confusion in Fan Ruoruo's heart. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said self-mockingly, "The emperor has already decided for me to take over the position of director of the Overwatch Council in a few days." This was something that happened naturally. Fan Ruoruo did not congratulate him. On the contrary, the confusion in her heart grew stronger and stronger. Since the emperor's favor was the same as before, why did the emperor choose to suppress her brother's power at this time? Give a carrot, and you have to hit it with a stick. The emperor is always careful of his limits. This is to remind me and, in reality, to weaken me. He doesn't want to see an official with too much power in his hands. Fan Xian looked at his sister and suddenly furrowed his brows. With slight mockery, he said, "Most importantly, the situation before us is the one the emperor has arranged for the future of the Qin kingdom. The Hall of Governmental Affairs is the center, with Hu the scholar leading the court. Below, the Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate check and balance each other. The Overwatch Council has hundreds of officials. Only by doing this can the peace of the court be ensured. He is beginning to test the effects and see what his Qin kingdom will be like 100 years from now." "But, He Zongwei is also in the Hall of Governmental Affairs," Fan Ruoruo asked with confusion. "This is because the power of the Overwatch Council is too great. In the past, it was Chen Pingping. Of all the civil and military officials in court, including my father-in-law, who could suppress him? Later, it was me. Just based on He Zongwei's identity as the imperial censorate of the left and the emperor's favor, it was impossible for him to oppose me," Fan Xian said. Thus, the emperor had no choice but to have He Zongwei enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs and forcefully raise his rank. Now, he is helping He Zongwei cut my shoulders. Of course, if He Zongwei's power in court truly grows, the emperor will certainly help me cut him down, Fan Xian said with a smile. What **t emperor schemes and the way of balance. It's all just eating too much and having nothing better to do. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a long time. She then said, "But, the young lady of the Sun family is still in the side hall." Hearing this, she understood that the situation with the Jingdo magistrate was indeed urgent. However, she had heard her brother say that this was the emperor's arrangement. She had never thought that Fan Xian would be able to help the Sun family. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian was silent for a long time and then said, "Go tell Sun Pin, or that I will go the day after tomorrow." Fan Ruoruo was startled and said, "Didn't you say earlier that this was the emperor's intention?" Fan Xian lowered his head and crossed his hands calmly in front of his abdomen. "The emperor and I had a tacit understanding 3 years ago. If it had been before, if the emperor wanted to cut my power, I would have let him cut it. So what if I let He Zongwei be arrogant for a while? But, not now." He raised his head and smiled. "I don't know what will happen in the future, so I have to ensure that I can still hold enough power now." "You want to fight the emperor?" Fan Ruoruo's eyes were wide open as she asked with unease and shock. "I am still a young man. It is always allowed to have some anger in my heart." Fan Xian smiled slightly. His smile was fresh and cheerful. There was not a trace of anger to be seen. His thoughts were actually very simple. Presently, he had to protect everyone he wanted to protect. He had to temporarily maintain the power in his hands under the pretext of being angry. Only then could he learn to face the powerful emperor head-on. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a long time. She knew that her brother had made up his mind and didn't say anything more. She just couldn't resist smiling and asking, "Are you really not going to keep the young lady of the Sun family company and talk? I'm very afraid that she won't be able to marry in the future." "It's better not to see her," Fan Xian said helplessly. "Just tell her that I am looking forward to the birthday banquet the day after tomorrow." I didn't think that while I was having so much fun yesterday, I would still stir up some trouble. It's a bit of a headache. However, I really don't have much energy, so I'm too lazy to argue. Relaxing and having fun is the right way, right? The title of today's chapter is the name of a variety show. Who has seen it? Let's talk about the last few sentences of the month. Dear leaders and comrades, we've been following that lewd old man for a whole month. Whether it's speeding up a few steps and catching up with him to intercept him, or following him intimately, we've scared him so much that his little heart is pounding. We're waiting for today, we're waiting for today. Chapter 656. I also know that these words aren't as awesome as I said a few days ago. It's mainly because of Liang Hechuan's influence. Monthly votes aren't AC Nielsen's ratings, but they're even more evil than ratings. On one hand, it's the most direct ranking, and on the other hand, it's the most direct money. In any case, I have to pull one last vote. Who knows what you bad people who only voted 3,000 words today will come up with. In short, the monthly ticket is evil, but it's also my favorite. You, that's you, don't turn your head to look at other people in the internet cafe, and don't look at your wife who is playing Fight the Landlord on her laptop. That's you, put down the evil monthly ticket that people love and hate. Thank you everyone for your hard work and support this month. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.